Welcome to the Night Crew. I am glad you could make it. Tonight we are looking at 12 stories from a very specific window in time, the mid-1970s. It was an era where the world felt larger and secrets were much easier to keep. This episode is designed for you to listen to while settling in, maybe with some rain sounds to help you drift off. If you are enjoying these, I would love for you to subscribe. Leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight. Before we get into the first story, just a quick reminder to check the locks on your front door. The like button is great, but it is not going to do much if someone is standing on your porch. It is just better to be sure about who is outside before you close your eyes. Stay safe. Let's get into the first story. In the late 1970s, a man in Victoria, Australia was known to visit the graves of people he had not killed yet. He would walk through the dense bushland and leave wild flowers on patches of dirt that would soon become crime scenes. He was not mourning the dead. He was marking the ground for the living. It would take years for the police to realize that the flowers were not a tribute but a countdown. Let's look at what happened in the Tynong North Forest. The air in the Tynong North bushland has a way of turning cold long before the sun actually goes down. In the late afternoon, a thick mist rolls in from the valleys, clinging to the eucalyptus trees and dampening the sound of everything beneath the canopy. The only thing you can really hear is the occasional snap of a dry branch or the heavy rhythmic crunch of work boots moving through the layers of rotting leaves. It is a place where a person can feel completely alone, even if they aren't. During the summer of 1977, Melbourne felt like a city on the rise. People were moving out to the suburbs, taking advantage of the new transit hubs and the sprawling shopping centers that promised a modern, quiet life. For the young women living in places like Frankston or Berwick, the daily rhythm was predictable. They caught the bus to work, met friends for coffee near the train stations, and walked home along well-lit streets. There was a sense that the community was tight. Bertha Miller was 62 years old and lived for the small, steady comforts of her neighborhood. Every morning she followed the same ritual, the low whistle of the tea kettle, the soft texture of her favorite wool sweater, and the short walk to the bus stop. She was a woman of habit known by the local shopkeepers for her polite smile and her punctuality. To Bertha, the bus route wasn't just transportation. It was a familiar thread that connected her quiet home to the vibrant heart of the city. On her commute, Bertha liked to watch the landscape change from the window of the bus. She knew every stop, every leaning fence, and every familiar face that climbed aboard. The bus drivers often nodded to her, recognizing the woman who always had her fare ready and never complained about the rain. There was a deep, unshakable trust in this routine. The transit line was a shared space where everyone belonged, and Bertha felt like a permanent part of that moving world anchored by the reliability of the clock. A few miles away, 13-year-old Catherine Headland was experiencing the first real sparks of independence. To her, the local shopping mall was the center of the universe, a place of bright lights and endless possibilities. She spent her afternoons browsing the record stores and laughing with friends, her pockets filled with the small treasures of a teenager. She was a bright, energetic girl who viewed the walk from the bus stop as a few minutes of freedom before she had to be home for dinner with her parents. Catherine's most prized possession that week was a small red hair clip, a gift from a friend that she wore with a sense of pride. She often reached up to touch it, making sure it was still perfectly in place as she navigated the busy crowds. She moved through the public spaces of Melbourne with the confidence of someone who had never known a reason to be afraid. To Catherine, the world was a wide, inviting place, and the path home was a simple line she had walked 100 times without incident. The transit hubs themselves were the lifeblood of the suburbs. The air at the stations smelled of diesel fumes and burnt coffee, a constant bustle of people moving toward their futures. Commuters stood shoulder to shoulder on the platforms, lost in their own thoughts, but comforted by the presence of others. It was a place where you could be anonymous, but still feel part of a crowd. No one noticed the quiet man sitting in the back of a parked van, or the figure lingering near the edge of the shadows. In the late 70s, the social fabric of Victoria relied on a shared understanding of safety. Families left their back doors unlocked while they ran errands, and children played in the parks until the streetlights flickered on. The transition from a small-town feel to a major metropolitan area was happening fast, but the old habits of trust remained. People believed that if you stayed on the path and followed the rules, the city would protect you. The idea of a predator blending into this backdrop was unthinkable. The man watching these spaces understood that trust better than anyone. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a neighbor, a laborer, or a fellow commuter. He spent his days observing the rhythms of the bus stops and the timing of the foot traffic. He knew which streetlights were dim and which shortcuts were isolated. He was a student of the ordinary, waiting for the one moment when a person's routine took them just a few steps away from the safety of the crowd and into the reach of the silence. The first break in the rhythm happened on a Tuesday. Bertha Miller stood at her usual bus stop, checking her watch as the minutes ticked past the scheduled arrival. When she did not return home that evening, her family assumed there had been a simple delay or a missed connection. But as the hours turned into a full night, the silence from her end became heavy. It was the first time in 20 years she had missed a meal without calling. It was a small, confusing deviation that didn't feel like a tragedy yet. A few weeks later, young Catherine Headland also failed to walk through her front door. In her case, the only thing left behind was a single red hair clip found lying in the gravel of a parking lot. It sat there against the gray stones, a bright splash of color that looked entirely out of place. To any passerby, it was just a lost trinket. But to her parents, it was a signal that the world had suddenly shifted. Two people had evaporated from public spaces, leaving no footprints and no witnesses. Over the next 3 years, the list of names grew. It was not just the elderly or the very young. It was women from all walks of life, snatched from transit hubs and busy shopping centers. The pressure in Melbourne began to tighten until it was a physical weight. People stopped walking alone to their cars, and the once trusted bus routes now felt like hunting grounds. Every time a new person went missing, the city would hold its breath, waiting for a sign that never came. There was no motive and no demand. The fear changed the way the city moved. You could see it in the way people avoided eye contact on the trains and how quickly they moved from the station to their front doors. The police were working thousands of hours, but they were chasing a shadow. There were no struggle marks and no consistent vehicle descriptions. It was as if a predator had learned how to blend into the gray background of the city so perfectly that he had become part of the landscape. The point of no return had been crossed. In 1980, a hiker was making his way through the dense scrub of Tynong North, far from the paved roads and the city lights. He was looking for a specific type of timber when he stepped onto a patch of ground that felt unusually soft. When he looked down, he saw something white poking through the damp, rotting leaves. He thought it was a piece of discarded plastic. He leaned down and brushed the dirt away, only to find a skeletal hand reaching up toward the sky. He didn't wait to see the rest. When the forensic teams arrived, they realized the hiker had only found the beginning. As they cleared the forest floor, more remains began to emerge from the mud. They were not scattered or hidden in a panic. Each set of remains was placed in a specific area, separated by a few yards of dense brush. The site was not a dumping ground, it was a curated space. The isolation of the bushland had kept the secret for years, protected by the mist and the deep silence of the valley. The search had finally come to an end. The investigators found a detail that chilled them more than the bodies. Each victim had been carefully arranged in a specific sequence, and the killer had covered them with wild flowers. The flowers were long dead, pressed into the clothing and the bone, but the intent was clear. This was a man who spent time with his victims after they were gone. He did not just discard them, he decorated them. He had returned to this remote forest again and again, moving through the bush with a familiarity that suggested he belonged. The personal items of the victims were found in visible areas along the forest tracks, almost as if they were being used as markers. A handbag here, a shoe there. It was a taunt directed at anyone who entered his domain. The $6 million reward offered by the government was the largest in Australian history, reflecting the desperation of a police force that had no leads. They interviewed truck drivers and laborers, but the man they were looking for seemed to have no face and no name that anyone could remember. The only real lead came from a woman named Margaret. A year earlier, she had been approached by a man in a van while she was waiting for a bus. He offered her a ride, speaking in a calm, flat tone that didn't set off any alarms. But when she looked into the back of the vehicle, she saw a roll of heavy plastic and a set of cleaning supplies. Something in her gut told her to step back. The man didn't argue. He just closed the door and drove away into the evening traffic, disappearing instantly. Margaret told the police she couldn't describe his face because it was too ordinary. There were no scars and no defining features. He was just a man in his 30s who looked like he belonged in a hardware store. This was the twist that broke the investigation. The predator wasn't a monster. He was the person sitting next to you at a red light. He used the very transit systems the city relied on to find his targets, turning the architecture of modern life against the people living within it. The most haunting realization came when the police mapped the timeline of the search parties. During the years when volunteers were combing the outskirts of the city, the killer was likely watching them from the edge of the Tynong North Forest. He knew exactly where the search lines ended and where the dense scrub began. He had used the public's fear to fuel his own sense of power, returning to the wild flowers and the silent graves while the rest of the country was mourning. He was never caught. The final reconstruction of the crimes showed a man with total control. He would use the paralyzing effect of a blunt object to take his victims quickly, then transport them in a covered vehicle to the bushland. There he would perform his rituals, arranging the bodies to face the rising sun before covering them with the local flora. His method was built on the invisibility of his movements and his lack of a forensic footprint. He didn't leave DNA because he didn't struggle. He simply waited for the perfect moment. This was a man who viewed himself as a gardener of the dead. He didn't just kill, he cultivated a landscape of tragedy that he could visit whenever he chose. His obsession with ritual suggests a mind that felt powerless in every other aspect of life, finding its only sense of authority in the silence of the Tynong North trees. He was a predator who understood that in a growing city the easiest way to hide is to remain perfectly normal. He thrived in the spaces between the bus stops and the mist. In late 2025, Victoria Police conducted a new round of advanced DNA sequencing on trace evidence found in the 1977 evidence locker. While the killer likely passed away decades ago, the technology is finally catching up to the ghost that haunted Melbourne for so long. The families still wait for a final name to be etched into the record, but for now, the Tynong North Forest remains a place of long shadows. The red hair clip is still preserved in a file, a small reminder of a life interrupted. The silence of the Australian bush has a weight all its own, a feeling that the land itself is keeping a secret. But sometimes the secrets aren't buried in the dirt. Sometimes they are hidden in plain sight on the very roads we use to get home. On a summer night in Germany, two sisters were about to learn that the highway holds more than just the sound of passing cars. There are things waiting in the grass along the pavement that no one is meant to find. The Autobahn is a place that never really sleeps. Even in the middle of the night, you can hear the low, rhythmic hum of tires against the pavement, a sound that carries for miles across the German countryside. In the summer of 1976, that sound was a constant companion for the families living in the state of Hessen. It was the backdrop to their lives, a reminder of the busy world moving just past their quiet villages. Monika Weimar lived in a house that felt far removed from that noise. She was a woman who took pride in the order of her home and the appearance of her two young daughters. Melanie was 7 and Carola was 5, and they were the kind of children who seemed to belong in a storybook. They had identical dresses and blonde hair that Monika kept perfectly brushed. To the neighbors, the Weimars were the definition of a stable, hardworking German family. The heat that August was particularly heavy, the kind of weather that makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Monika spent her mornings moving through the kitchen, the sunlight streaming across the polished linoleum. She prepared sandwiches for the girls, the sound of the knife against the wooden board, the only noise in the house. There was a quiet satisfaction in the routine of it, a sense that as long as the chores were done, the day was a success. Melanie and Carola were inseparable. Because they were so close in age, they shared a secret language of giggles and whispers that their parents could not always decipher. They spent most of their time in the backyard, a small patch of green surrounded by a wooden fence. From her position at the sink, Monika could hear them playing. It was a comforting sound, a signal that her world was exactly as it should be, contained and protected from the outside. Reinhard, their father, was a man of few words, who worked long hours to provide for them. When he came home, the house would shift its energy to accommodate his presence. He was a steady figure, someone who believed in the traditional roles of a household. Monika ensured that the table was set and the girls were clean before he walked through the door. It was a performance of domesticity that she had mastered over the years, a way of keeping the peace. On the day the girls disappeared, the rhythm of the house started out normally. The sun was high, and the sky was a clear, piercing blue. Monika had put the girls in their matching summer dresses, smoothing the fabric over their shoulders with a practiced hand. She told them to stay in the yard while she finished some cleaning inside. The screen door clicked shut, and for a few minutes Monika was alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. She moved through the rooms with a focused energy, wiping down surfaces and straightening cushions. She was a woman who noticed every stray thread and every smudge on the glass. This need for control was a central part of who she was, a way to manage the hidden pressures that most people in town never saw. She valued the silence of the house, using those moments to reset herself before the girls would inevitably come back inside, looking for a snack or a drink. Outside, the girls were building a world of their own in the shadow of the garden shed. Melanie was the leader, organizing their games with the seriousness of a school teacher, while Carola followed along, her small hands busy with the dirt and the grass. They were oblivious to the heat or the world beyond the fence. To them, the yard was a kingdom, and the wooden slats were the boundaries of the universe. They had no reason to look toward the gate or the road. Monika eventually paused her work to check on them. She stood by the window, her hand resting on the cool glass. She could see their toys scattered near the rose bushes, but the girls themselves were not in her direct line of sight. She did not worry immediately. Children had a way of finding the deepest shadows when the sun was at its peak. She went back to her task, the floorboards creaking under her weight as she moved toward the laundry room in the back. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a lack of one. When Monika opened the back door to call them in for a glass of juice, the yard was unnervingly still. The air was dead, and the constant chatter that usually filled the space had evaporated. She stepped out onto the porch, the heat hitting her face like a physical wall. She called their names, her voice sounding thin and small in the open air. There was no response, only the distant drone of a lawnmower. She walked to the edge of the fence, her pace quickening. The gate, which was supposed to be latched, was standing open just a few inches. It was a small detail, but it felt like a fracture in the world. She looked out at the road, but it was empty, the asphalt shimmering under the midday sun. Her breathing became shallow, and she felt a sudden sharp tension in her shoulders. She called out again, her voice louder, this time tinged with a confusion that was starting to turn into a cold, heavy weight. Within the hour, the quiet village of Philipsthal was transformed. Neighbors who had been resting in the shade were suddenly on their feet, fanning out across the fields and into the nearby woods. The search was organized with the efficiency of a military operation. People who barely knew the Weimars were calling out the names of the girls, their voices echoing through the trees. The local police arrived shortly after, their blue lights flashing against the green backdrop of the valley. Monika sat on her front porch, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white, and she stared straight ahead, as if she could pull the girls back into view through sheer force of will. Every time a searcher returned with no news, the air around her seemed to get thinner. The officers asked her the same questions over and over. What were they wearing? Which direction were they facing? Did she see any strange vehicles? She answered with a mechanical precision. As evening approached, the sky turned a deep bruised purple. The search parties used flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness like frantic needles. The woods around the village were dense, filled with tangled undergrowth and steep ravines. It was a terrifying place for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old to be alone at night. The temperature dropped, and a light mist began to settle over the ground, making the search even more difficult. The hope of finding them nearby was fading fast. On the other side of the region, miles away from the village, a truck driver pulled his rig into a small rest area along the Autobahn. He was exhausted from a long haul and needed a few minutes of fresh air before continuing through the night. As he stepped out of the cab, he noticed something white on the patch of grass near the edge of the parking lot. In the moonlight, it looked like a discarded bag or a piece of trash. He walked toward it, his boots crunching on the gravel. When he got closer, his heart began to pound against his ribs. It was not trash, it was a dress. It was lying perfectly flat on the grass, the fabric smoothed out as if it were on a hanger. It was an identical match to the one Monika had described to the police earlier that day. A few yards further down the slope, he saw a second dress laid out in the exact same manner. There was no sign of the children, only the empty, silent fabric. It was a scene that felt staged for anyone who looked. The police arrived at the rest area within minutes. The lead investigator, a man who had seen decades of crime in the state of Hessen, stood over the dresses with a look of profound confusion. There were no drag marks in the dirt and no signs of a struggle. It was as if the girls had simply stepped out of their clothes and vanished into the night air. The location was miles from their home, a place that required a car and a specific knowledge of the highway's layout. The search area shifted to the stretches of woods bordering the Autobahn. Canine units were brought in, the dogs straining against their leashes as they caught the scent. The sound of the highway was a constant roar in the background, a sharp contrast to the grim work being done in the shadows of the trees. Every officer felt the pressure. This was not just a disappearance anymore. It was something far more calculated. Someone had taken the time to arrange the clothes. 3 days after the girls vanished, the call finally came in. A search team deep in the woods, nearly a mile from the rest area, found the children. They were lying in a clearing, the sunlight filtering down through the canopy to illuminate the tragedy. Like the dresses, their bodies were positioned with a chilling level of care. There was no immediate sign of how they had died, but it was clear they had not wandered off. They had been placed there discarded like broken dolls. Back at the police station, the investigation took a sharp turn. The officers who had initially sympathized with Monika began to look at her through a different lens. They noticed that her grief seemed to come in waves that coincided with when people were watching. When she thought she was alone, her expression was neutral, almost detached. It was a subtle shift, but in a small town where everyone is an amateur psychologist, it was enough to spark the first whispers of suspicion. The lead detective sat across from Monika in a small, windowless interview room. The air was stale and smelled of cigarette smoke. He watched her carefully, noting the way she adjusted her sleeve and the way she refused to make eye contact. He asked her to walk him through the timeline of that morning one more time. This time, her story changed. She mentioned a strange man in a dark car, a detail she had not included in her initial report. It was the first crack in the wall. As the interrogation continued into the night, Monika's story shifted again. She began to cry, but the tears felt rehearsed, falling at the exact moment she reached the most dramatic part of her narrative. Suddenly, she dropped the story about the stranger. She looked at the detective and told him that it was not a man in a car. It was her husband, Reinhard. She claimed he had killed the girls in a fit of rage because he suspected she was having an affair. It was a total bombshell. Reinhard was brought in for questioning immediately. He was a man who looked like he had been hollowed out by grief. When they told him about Monika's accusation, he did not scream or protest. He simply sat there, his head in his hands, and whispered that it was not true. He had been at work all day, a fact that his supervisor and 3 coworkers were able to confirm. The timeline Monika provided for his supposed crime did not match the reality. The suspicion turned back to her. The forensic team working on the case was led by a man who specialized in trace evidence. He spent days going through the girls' dresses and the clothing Monika had worn on the day of the disappearance. Under the microscope, the truth began to emerge. He found microscopic fibers from Monika's own blouse embedded in the fabric of the girls' dresses, and more importantly, he found forest debris on her shoes that matched the specific soil and plant life of the disposal site. He also discovered something that no one expected. There was no evidence of an outside struggle, but there were signs that the girls had been smothered. It was a quiet, intimate way to kill something that required the victims to trust the person who was holding them. This detail, combined with the fiber evidence, created a picture of a mother who had systematically ended the lives of her own children before driving them to the highway and staging the scene for the police. The investigators dug deeper into Monika's personal life. They discovered that she had indeed been having an affair with a man from a nearby town. She had been desperate to start a new life with him, a life that did not include the responsibilities of a family or the demands of a husband she no longer loved. To Monika, the girls were not just children, they were obstacles. In her mind, the only way to reach the freedom she craved was to remove the things that were holding her. The trial of Monika Weimar was one of the most polarizing events in modern German history. The courtroom was packed every day with crowds gathering outside to catch a glimpse of the woman they called the ghost of the Autobahn. The prosecution presented the fiber evidence and the testimony of the forensic experts, painting a picture of a cold, calculating killer. Monika sat at the defense table, her face a mask of stoic defiance. She maintained her innocence throughout. The defense argued that the fiber evidence was contaminated, and that Monika was the victim of a sexist legal system that could not believe a mother was innocent if she was also unfaithful. They played on the public's sympathy, portraying her as a grieving woman who had been broken by the loss of her children and the pressure of the investigation. The jury was torn. In the first trial, she was sentenced to life in prison, but the legal battle was only beginning for the family. In 1997, a retrial was granted. New lawyers argued that the original investigation had been flawed and that there was reasonable doubt about the timeline of the murders. Monika was briefly acquitted and walked out of prison a free woman. She was older, her hair turning gray, but her expression remained as unreadable as it had been 20 earlier. She tried to blend back into society, but the stigma followed her. The public never truly accepted her innocence. The final legal decision came down a few years later, reinstating her original conviction. The court ruled that the cumulative evidence was too strong to ignore. Monika was returned to prison to serve out the remainder of her sentence. Throughout the entire process, she never confessed. She never showed a moment of regret or shared a single detail about what had actually happened in that backyard in Hessen. She remained a locked room, keeping the truth entirely for herself. The reconstruction of the crime revealed a terrifying sequence of events. Monika had likely waited until the girls were tired from their play, then led them into the house one by one. She had used a pillow or her own hands to end their lives, a process that would have taken several minutes for each child. Then, with the bodies in the car, she had driven onto the Autobahn, the same highway she had seen from her window every day. She had chosen the rest area specifically. The most chilling part of the method was the staging. After disposing of the bodies, she had taken the time to lay out the dresses on the grass. She wanted them to be found. She wanted the world to see a tragedy that looked like a mystery, a puzzle that would lead the police away from her and toward an imaginary monster. It was a performance of grief, designed before the grief even existed. She had calculated the impact of the visual image of the matching dresses on the grass. This level of planning pointed toward a personality that was completely devoid of empathy. Monika Weimar was a woman who could brush her daughter's hair in the morning and smooth out their death shrouds in the evening without a flicker of emotion. Her narcissism was her shield, allowing her to believe that she was smarter than the investigators and the forensic scientists. She saw the world as a stage where she was the only real actor, and everyone else was just a prop. The state of Hessen eventually moved on from the tragedy, but the memory of the two girls in the clearing remained. A small memorial was placed near the edge of the woods, often covered in fresh flowers from strangers who still felt the weight of the loss. Reinhard Weimar lived out the rest of his life in a state of quiet devastation, never recovering from the accusation or the loss of his family. He died a few years ago, taking his own share of the silence with him to the grave. Today, Monika Weimar is a free woman, once again having served her full sentence. She lives in total seclusion under a different name, far from the hills of Hessen and the reach of the media. She has never given an interview or written a book. She exists in the shadows of society, a ghost of the Autobahn who managed to survive the legal system but could never escape the truth. The identical dresses are still in an evidence locker, the fabric faded but the message still clear. The roar of the highway continues, a never-ending stream of traffic moving toward the horizon. People pass the rest areas and the stretches of woods without knowing the stories that are buried just a few yards from the asphalt. But sometimes when the air is still and the moon is high, the silence of the woods feels a little more heavy. It is a reminder that the most ordinary places can hold the darkest secrets, and that the person driving the car next to you might be a stranger. That was the summer of 1976. Just a few months later, in the rural hills of Italy, another family was sitting down for a dinner they would never finish. They were in a place where the history was deep and the local traditions were a mix of faith and something much older. In a house surrounded by vineyards and salt-dusted earth, the shadows were beginning to stretch toward the door, carrying a ritual that had been waiting in the dark for a long, long time. The wind that blows across the Marche region of Italy in October has a sharp metallic edge to it. It carries the scent of damp earth and the heavy sweet aroma of overripe grapes left on the vine. In the hills surrounding Macerata, the 1976 harvest was already coming to a close, leaving the landscape quiet and expectant. Inside a low-slung stone farmhouse at the end of a long gravel drive, the air was perfectly still. It was heavy with the thick, cloying smell of half-burnt wax and the sharp, alkaline tang of dry salt. Giampiero Ciccioli was a man who lived by the clock and the seasons. At 42 years old, his hands were thick and calloused from a lifetime of working the soil, his skin tanned to the color of cured leather. He viewed the land not just as his livelihood, but as a legacy he was holding in trust for his children. Every morning at 5, he would stand on the back porch, watching the mist lift off the vineyards, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back and the rough texture of the stone under his palms. To Giampiero, there was a profound sense of order in his rural world. He took pride in the straightness of his rows and the sturdiness of the fences he had built with his own hands. Life was a series of small, meaningful tasks that had to be done correctly. He believed that if you respected the earth and the traditions of your ancestors, the world would remain stable. He found comfort in the predictable rhythm of the seasons, the way the light shifted in the fall, and the steady grounding presence of his family. Maria, his wife, was the heartbeat of the home. She was 38, a woman with a quick laugh and an even quicker mind for the logistics of a working farm. She spent her days in a state of constant motion, moving between the garden, the kitchen, and the laundry lines. Her hands were always busy, stained with the juices of preserved tomatoes or the flour of the evening's bread. She spoke to the plants and the animals with a gentle familiarity, as if they were part of a larger conversation she had been having for years. In the late afternoon, Maria would sit in the kitchen, the sun casting long golden bars across the wooden table. She used those quiet moments to mend clothes or check the ledgers, the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, providing a soft, white noise backdrop to her thoughts. She didn't mind the isolation of the farm. In fact, she cherished it. To her, the distance between their house and the village was a protective barrier, a way to keep the complications of the modern world from reaching her children. Paolo was 8 and Sofia was 6, and they were the light of the Ciccioli household. They spent their days as a pair of small, energetic shadows, following their father through the fields or helping Maria gather eggs. Paolo was the serious one, already trying to match his father's stride, while Sofia was a dreamer who could spend an hour watching a beetle crawl across a leaf. They were healthy, happy children who saw the farm as a vast, enchanted kingdom where every stone and tree had a story. The children's bedroom was filled with the small artifacts of their discoveries. Paolo had a collection of smooth river stones arranged by size, and Sofia had pressed wildflowers tucked into the pages of her school books. They spent their evenings drawing on the kitchen table while Giampiero read the paper and Maria finished the dishes. The house was filled with the sounds of their childhood, the scrape of crayons, the soft thud of a ball against a wall, and the high-pitched music of their shared laughter. Every night the family would gather for dinner at 7 o'clock sharp. It was a ritual that Giampiero insisted upon. It was the time when the work of the day was put aside and the family became a single, cohesive unit. They sat around the heavy oak table in the dining room, the candlelight flickering against the white plaster walls. Maria would bring out steaming bowls of pasta and plates of roasted meat, the steam rising in the cool evening air. It was a scene of domestic peace that had remained unchanged for generations. The Marche region is a place where history is never truly buried. The locals in Macerata still spoke of the old ways of the folk magic that had survived alongside the church for centuries. There were stories of secret societies that met in the ruins of medieval towers and rituals performed in the dark of the moon to ensure a good harvest. Giampiero dismissed these tales as superstition, but Maria sometimes left a small bowl of milk on the porch, a quiet nod to the traditions her grandmother had taught her. In the autumn of 1976, the pressure of the outside world felt distant. While the rest of Italy was grappling with political unrest and social change, the Ciccioli family remained focused on the immediate needs of the farm. They were preparing for the coming winter, stacking wood and storing grain. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, the satisfaction of a harvest well handled. They had no reason to believe that the silence of the hills was anything other than the natural peace of the countryside. One Friday evening, Giampiero stood in the doorway of the barn looking toward the house. The windows were glowing with a warm, inviting light. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of gratitude for his life. He adjusted the heavy collar of his coat, the fabric rough against his neck, and took a deep breath of the cold, crisp air. He could hear Maria calling the children in for dinner, her voice clear and steady across the yard. He turned the heavy iron key in the barn lock, the metallic click echoing in the still night. Inside the house, Maria was setting the table. She smoothed the linen cloth with her hand, noting a small stain that would need to be treated later. She placed the silverware with a practiced rhythm, the clinking of the metal, the only sound in the room. The children were already in their seats, their faces scrubbed clean. There was a comfortable, easy silence between them, the kind that only exists in families who know each other's hearts. Everything was in its proper place. Everything was as it should be. Giampiero walked into the dining room, his boots making a dull thud on the rug. He took his place at the head of the table and looked at his family. He felt a brief, strange sensation of pressure in his chest, a sudden awareness of how much he had to lose. It was a passing thought, a momentary glitch in his usual stoicism. He reached out and took Maria's hand, her skin warm and familiar. He smiled at the children, and for a second the entire world felt contained within the four walls of that room. The following Monday, a neighbor named Signor Rossi noticed something unusual as he drove his tractor past the Ciccioli drive. The mail was still sitting in the box at the end of the road, and the family's old dog was sitting by the front gate whimpering. Usually the dog followed Giampiero everywhere, and the mail was collected by 8 in the morning. Rossi slowed his engine, the rhythmic chugging of the tractor, the only sound in the valley. He looked toward the house, but the shutters were all tightly closed. Rossi felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. He knew Giampiero was a man of strict routine. To see the mail piling up was like seeing a clock that had stopped at the wrong time. He pulled his tractor to the side of the road and walked up the gravel drive. The dog didn't bark. It simply looked at him with wet, frightened eyes and pressed its body against his leg. The animal was shivering, its muscles tense with a fear that Rossi couldn't yet identify. When Rossi reached the front porch, he knocked loudly on the heavy oak door. There was no answer. He tried the handle, but it was locked tight from the inside. He walked around the perimeter of the house, checking every window. Each one was bolted the heavy wooden shutters, offering no glimpse into the interior. He shouted Giampiero's name, his voice sounding desperate in the open air. The silence that came back was absolute. It was a silence that felt heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Rossi called the local carabinieri from the nearest farm. When the officers arrived, they found the neighbor standing in the yard, his hands trembling. He told them about the dog and the mail, his words coming in short, jagged bursts. The officers looked at the locked house and the shuttered windows. They sensed the same wrongness that Rossi had felt. They didn't wait for a warrant. One of the officers used a heavy shoulder to force the back door open, the wood splintering with a sharp, violent crack. The air that rushed out of the house was cold and carried the heavy scent of unburnt wax and something metallic. The officers moved into the kitchen, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The room was perfectly tidy. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs or broken glass. They moved toward the dining room, their footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. As they stepped through the doorway, the beams of their lights fell on a scene that would haunt the village of Macerata for decades. The Ciccioli family was still sitting at the dinner table. Giampiero was at the head, Maria was at the foot, and the two children were in their usual seats along the side. They looked almost as if they were frozen in time, their bodies upright and their heads all facing toward the east. Their eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. On the table, the plates of food were untouched, the pasta cold and congealed in the bowls. The candles had long ago burned down to nothing, leaving only pools of white wax. The most chilling detail was on the floor. Perfectly symmetrical circles of white salt had been sprinkled around each chair. The salt was bright against the dark wood, the lines so crisp, and even they looked as if they had been drawn with a compass. There were no footprints in the salt, and no sign that anyone had walked through the circles after they were placed. It was as if the family had been sealed into their positions by an invisible hand. The officers felt a sudden, numbing cold seep into their bones. The investigation began in a state of shock. The medical examiner found that each member of the family had been killed with a single, precise stab wound to the heart. There were no defensive wounds, no signs that any of them had tried to fight back. In fact, toxicology reports later showed that the family had been heavily drugged. A powerful sedative had been slipped into the wine and the water, ensuring that they were unconscious or paralyzed before the killer ever touched them. They had died without ever knowing the danger was in the room. As the police moved through the rest of the house, they found more evidence of a ritual. In the children's bedroom, large crude symbols had been drawn on the walls in charcoal. They were ancient, jagged shapes that seemed to vibrate in the light of the flashlights. The local priest was brought in, and his face turned pale as he looked at the drawings. He identified them as ancient medieval curses, symbols meant to bind the spirits of the dead to the earth. They were drawings that hadn't been seen in the region for centuries. The priest explained that the salt circles were a traditional way to protect a space from evil or to trap a soul within a boundary. The fact that the bodies were facing east suggested a twisted version of a resurrection ritual. The killer hadn't just murdered the family. They had performed a complex dark ceremony that lasted for hours after the deaths. The killer had stayed in the house, moving around the table, drawing on the walls, and carefully arranging the salt, while the family sat in their final silent dinner. The investigation hit a wall of silence. There were no fingerprints on the salt shakers or the charcoal. The doors had been locked from the inside, a feat that suggested the killer had a key or knew a way to bolt the house from the exterior that the police couldn't find. Every occult group and spiritual society in the Marche region was interrogated, but no one had any connection to the Cicciolis. The family had no enemies, no debts, and no secrets that would lead to such a calculated ritualistic execution. The local community was paralyzed by fear. People began to believe that an invisible cult was moving through the hills, a group that could enter a locked home and vanish without a trace. The farmhouse was boarded up, the vineyards left to rot. No one wanted to buy the land, and even the local hunters avoided the area. The image of the salt circles and the charcoal drawings became a local legend, a story told in whispers to ensure that children stayed inside after dark. The climax of the case came when a young detective decided to re-examine the charcoal drawings. He noticed that the strokes were confident and smooth, suggesting the artist was not in a hurry. He realized that the killer must have felt completely safe inside the house. The killer wasn't a stranger hiding in the shadows. They were someone who knew the family's routine, someone who knew exactly when they sat down for dinner and where the spare key was kept. The danger had been invited in. The truth behind the massacre remained a mystery for nearly 50 years. The case was officially closed without charges, and the files were moved to the state archives. But the reconstruction of the crime suggested a level of psychopathy that was rare even in the most violent cases. The killer hadn't just wanted the family dead, they wanted to transform the family into a monument. Every action, from the drugging of the food to the placement of the salt, was part of a deliberate artistic vision. In 2025, a series of leaked documents from a private archive in the Vatican hinted at a darker possibility. The documents mentioned a small clandestine society active in rural Italy during the 1970s that practiced a form of cleansing rituals. They believed that certain families were carrying ancient spiritual debts, and that the only way to settle them was through a blood sacrifice and the binding of their souls. The Ciccioli family may have been chosen not for what they did, but for who they were. The farmhouse in Macerata still stands today, a gray stone skeleton surrounded by overgrown vines. Ghost hunters and urban explorers often visit the site, claiming to feel a sudden drop in temperature or the faint scent of burnt wax. They point to the faded outlines on the floor, where the salt circles once sat, a permanent stain on the wood. The house remains a locked room in the history of the region, a place where the ordinary life of a family was overwritten by a ritual they never understood. Sometimes, the things we do to protect ourselves, the locks on the doors, the rituals we follow, the trust we place in our neighbors, are exactly the things that lead the danger to us. We build our lives on the assumption that the world follows a set of rules, but there are people who play by a different set entirely. They don't want your money or your land. They want something much more permanent. They want to leave a mark that even time can't wash away. A phone left on a kitchen counter. That is all it was. A small plastic object that connected one world to another. In the next case, it wouldn't be a circle of salt or a charcoal drawing that told the story. It would be a simple note written in a steady hand and left in a place where it was guaranteed to be found. But before the note could be read, the woods around Vienna had to yield their own kneeling secrets to the twilight. The sound of dry oak leaves rustling in the wind is the only thing that breaks the silence of the Vienna woods as the sun begins to drop behind the hills. It is a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like a whisper, but it carries a weight that seems to pull the heat right out of the air. In the twilight, the shadows between the thick trunks grow long and distorted, turning the picturesque hiking trails into a labyrinth of gray and black. The forest is beautiful, but it is a place where the silence feels heavy. In the mid-1970s, the Wienerwald was the pride of the Austrian capital. For the people of Vienna, the forest was not just a collection of trees, it was a sanctuary. Every weekend, thousands of residents would leave the crowded city streets to lose themselves in the miles of marked trails that wound through the damp pine and ancient oak. It was a place of health, fresh air, and a deep national love for the outdoors. To the people here, the woods were an extension of their own homes. For a young woman living in the city, a solo hike through the woods was a common way to find a few hours of peace. There was a sense of ownership over the trails, a feeling that the forest was a shared backyard where nothing bad could ever happen. The paths were well maintained, and the sight of other hikers nodding in passing was a constant reassurance. The woods were a place of freedom, where the only thing to worry about was getting home before the rain started or the light faded. Elsa was 22 years old and worked as a clerk in a small shop near the center of Vienna. She was a person who valued her quiet time, often spending her Saturday mornings preparing a light lunch and checking the laces on her boots for the afternoon's walk. To Elsa, the forest was where she went to breathe. She loved the scent of damp earth and the way the light filtered through the canopy, creating a golden haze that felt like it belonged in a painting. She was a child of the city, but her heart was in the hills. She had a favorite trail that looped around an old stone bridge and climbed toward a ridge overlooking the valley. Elsa knew every bend in the path and every hidden clearing. She moved with the confidence of someone who had walked these hills since she was a child, her pace steady and her mind clear. She carried a small rucksack and a camera, hoping to catch the shift of the colors as autumn began to settle into the leaves. To Elsa, the forest was a friend, a reliable constant in her life. The routine was simple and comforting. She would catch the trolley to the edge of the woods, walk for 3 hours, and be back in the city in time to meet her friends for dinner. Her parents never worried when she left. It was just what young people in Vienna did. The woods were considered the lungs of the city, a wholesome environment where the air was clean and the people were respectful. It was a world built on the assumption that nature was the only thing that could be unpredictable or wild. As she walked, Elsa enjoyed the sensory details that defined her Saturdays. She liked the way the temperature dropped as she moved into the deeper sections of the woods and the way the pine needles muffled her footsteps. She would often stop to take a photograph of a mushroom or a particularly interesting rock formation. She was a meticulous person, someone who appreciated the small, quiet details of the world around her. For Elsa, these hikes were a way to reset her internal clock before the work week began again. On her final hike, the weather was unusually clear for October. The sky was a sharp, piercing blue, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from the distant farmhouses. Elsa reached the old stone bridge and paused to look down at the stream. The water was low, moving slowly over the gray rocks. She felt a sense of profound peace, a feeling that the world was exactly as it should be. She adjusted her rucksack and continued up the trail, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound on the hard-packed dirt. She didn't notice the silence at first. In the deeper parts of the woods, the birds often go quiet as the afternoon wears on and the wind tends to die down in the hollows. But as Elsa climbed toward the ridge, she felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air felt thicker, and the rustling of the leaves seemed to stop entirely. She paused for a moment, listening for the sound of another hiker, but there was nothing. It was just Elsa and the trees stretching out in every direction. One Saturday in October, a group of hikers stopped to rest near a massive oak tree that marked a junction in the trail. As they sat down, they noticed a small blue rucksack tucked neatly into the hollow of the roots. It wasn't tossed aside or forgotten in a hurry. It was placed there with a deliberate care that felt slightly off. They waited for 30 minutes, expecting the owner to return from a nearby stream, but the forest around them remained empty. The rucksack sat there, a bright blue spot against the gray wood. By the time the moon rose over the ridge, Elsa had not returned to her apartment. Her friends called her parents, and by morning, the police were beginning to trace her last known movements. They found that she wasn't the first. Over the last 18 months, 3 other young women had vanished from the same stretch of forest. Each time they had disappeared in broad daylight, leaving behind no sounds of a struggle and no witnesses to tell the story. The forest was starting to feel like a trap. The news of the disappearances spread through Vienna like a cold front. The once beloved hiking trails were suddenly empty, and the parents of young women kept their doors locked. The city was gripped by a fear that was both intense and invisible. There were no suspects and no clues, only the silent, indifferent trees. The police doubled their patrols, but the woods were too vast to be fully watched. Every hiker who braved the trails felt the weight of eyes they couldn't see watching from the thickets. A week into the search for Elsa, a volunteer team was moving through a particularly dense section of the woods far off the marked paths. They were pushing through a thicket of pine when they stepped into a small natural clearing. There, in the center of the space, they found her. She was not lying on the ground. She was in a kneeling position, her hands folded in her lap and her head bowed as if she were in the middle of a deep private prayer under the ancient oak trees. It was a sight that stopped their breath. The police were baffled by the scene. Elsa had been strangled with a complex series of knots that required a high level of skill to tie, but her body had been treated with a strange, dark reverence. Every detail of her pose was precise. There was no sign of the frantic violence usually found at a crime scene. Investigators brought in Professor Lang, a specialist in religious iconography, who noted that Elsa and the previous victims were all facing east toward the rising sun. The killer was acting out a ritual. As the investigation deepened, the police realized they were looking for someone with a very specific set of skills. The killer knew the forest terrain perfectly, but he also had a deep, perhaps obsessive connection to religious symbolism. The way the bodies were posed suggested he viewed the murders not as a crime, but as a ceremony. He spent a significant amount of time with the victims, after they were gone, meticulously arranging their limbs and covering them with pine branches. He was a man with a dark spiritual mission. The pressure on the authorities was immense. The public demanded an arrest, but the killer left no forensic evidence behind. There were no fingerprints on the rucksacks and no DNA under the fingernails. The professor argued that the killer likely saw himself as a savior, someone who was rescuing these women from a corrupt world. This psychological profile pointed towards someone who was a loner, likely a person who worked outdoors and felt a deep, distorted connection to the natural world and the divine. The breakthrough seemed to come when a local gardener, who worked on the estates bordering the forest, took his own life. In his small cottage, police found a collection of religious tracts and hand-drawn maps of the woods, but no direct forensic evidence linked him to the knots. The murders stopped abruptly that winter, leading the public to believe the threat was over. Yet the lead detectives remained uneasy. The complexity of the rituals and the precision of the stalking suggested a mind far more sophisticated than the man they had found. The gardener had been a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself, but his neighbors described him as having a strange, intense focus when he was working in the dirt. He was an expert in knots used for tying back vines and securing heavy equipment. While the police couldn't prove he was the killer, his death brought a grim closure to the case. The files were put away, but the questions remained. Many believed the real predator was still out there, hiding in the shadows of the city. Years later, a forestry worker clearing a collapsed ridge found a small wooden box buried under a pile of stones. Inside were the personal belongings of all 4 victims: Elsa's camera, a locket from the first girl, and a single glove from the third. The box had been carefully waterproofed and hidden in a place that overlooked the clearing where Elsa had been found. The killer hadn't just moved on. He had built a shrine to his work, a place where he could return to watch the clearing. The reconstruction of the crimes revealed a killer who was an expert in the terrain. He didn't chase his victims, he intercepted them. He knew the path so well that he could predict exactly where a hiker would be 10 minutes before they arrived. He would wait in the shadows of the pine, using a paralyzing grip to silence them before they could even draw a breath. Every knot he tied was a signature, a slow and deliberate act of control that turned a murder into a silent, dark ceremony. The killer viewed himself as a holy figure. In his twisted reality, the world was too corrupt for the innocence of the women he chose. By posing them in prayer and facing them toward the rising sun, he believed he was ensuring their transition to a higher power. His narcissism allowed him to feel like a guardian, a man who was performing a necessary service for the city. He didn't see himself as a monster, but as a silent caretaker of the souls he had claimed in the woods. The files on the Vienna woods killer remain partially open, a cold case that still haunts the older generation of Austrian detectives. Today, the Wienerwald is as beautiful as it ever was, filled with hikers and families every weekend. But the original warning signs from the 1970s, with their stark black lettering, are still kept in the police museum. They are a reminder of a year when the forest was not a sanctuary, but a cage built out of oak and silence. From the deep, suffocating woods of Austria, we move south to the Mediterranean. In a port city where the air smells of salt and heavy oil, the elegance of the 1970s was being used as a weapon. A different kind of predator was walking the streets of Piraeus, and he didn't need the cover of the trees to hide his intentions. He just needed a tailored suit and a pair of white silk gloves to make sure no one saw him coming. The high-pitched screech of a steel piano wire being pulled taut in a silent room is a sound that stays with a person. It is not a loud noise, but it has a frequency that seems to vibrate in the very center of the skull. In the upscale apartments of Piraeus, during the winter of 1975, that sound was the only warning. There was no struggle and no shouting. Just a sudden, sharp tension that cut through the salt-heavy air of the Greek port, leaving behind a silence that was far more terrifying than the act itself. In the mid-1970s, the city of Piraeus was a place of deep contrasts. It was the largest port in Greece, a hub of heavy industry and shipping, but it was also home to a rising middle class that took pride in its sophistication. The streets were filled with the scent of diesel fuel from the massive tankers and the salty tang of the Aegean Sea. But as you moved away from the docks and into the residential districts, the atmosphere shifted. Here the air was cleaner, smelling of jasmine and expensive tobacco. Elena was 24 years old and lived in a second-floor apartment that overlooked a narrow, tree-lined street. She was a woman who enjoyed the independence that her job at a local bank provided. Every morning she would walk to work, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the cobblestones. Elena loved the ritual of her day. The first cup of thick Greek coffee at the corner cafe, the polite nods from the shopkeepers, and the feeling of belonging to a city that was moving rapidly into the modern era. To Elena, the apartment was her sanctuary. It was filled with the things she had chosen for herself: a collection of French novels, a small record player, and a set of heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the bright Mediterranean sun when she wanted to rest. She was a person who appreciated order and beauty. She spent her Saturday mornings at the local markets, picking out fresh flowers and artisanal breads, moving through the crowds with a quiet confidence. She lived a life of simple, earned pleasures. The social scene in Piraeus during this time was vibrant and status-conscious. Young professionals gathered in the bars near the water to discuss music, politics, and the latest fashions from Paris and Milan. Elena was a part of this world, but she also cherished her solitude. She liked the feeling of coming home to her quiet rooms after a long day of numbers and transactions. She believed that as long as she was careful and kept to her routine, the city was a place where a woman could thrive on her own terms. Her apartment building was typical of the era, with high ceilings and wrought iron balconies that offered a view of the sunset over the harbor. The walls were thick, designed to keep out the heat of the summer, which meant that the sounds of the neighbors were usually muffled. Elena knew the people in her building by name: the elderly couple on the first floor, the student across the hall, but their lives rarely intersected. It was a community built on a shared respect for privacy and the quiet dignity of the middle class. During the winter months, the light in Piraeus takes on a gray metallic quality. The humidity from the sea hangs in the air, making the stones of the buildings feel damp to the touch. Elena found a certain beauty in this seasonal shift. She liked the way the city looked under a layer of mist, the harbor lights glowing like orange embers in the distance. She would often sit on her balcony for a few minutes before bed, wrapped in a thick shawl, watching the tankers move slowly across the dark water. She had a favorite dress that she wore on special occasions, a deep navy silk that caught the light whenever she moved. Elena was a woman who paid attention to the details of her appearance, not out of vanity, but because she believed that how you presented yourself to the world mattered. She saw it as a form of armor. If she looked professional and composed, the world would treat her with respect. It was a philosophy that had served her well in her career and her personal life. The first offbeat detail happened on a Tuesday evening in late November. Elena was walking home from the bank, the sun already dipping below the horizon. As she turned the corner onto her street, she noticed a man standing under a street lamp near her building. He was dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit and carried a polished walking cane with a silver handle. It was an unusual sight for the neighborhood. He looked like he belonged in a high-society ballroom rather than a quiet residential alley. He didn't move as she approached. He simply stood there, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hat. As Elena passed him, she caught a faint scent of lavender perfume. a scent that was too delicate and expensive for the environment. She felt a brief, strange sensation of coldness on her skin, but she pushed it aside. In a city like Piraeus, there were always travelers and businessmen moving through. She entered her building, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, and dismissed the encounter. Over the next few days, the man in the suit became a recurring shadow in the corner of her eye. She would see him near the cafe in the morning or leaning against a railing by the harbor as she walked home. He never spoke to her, and he never made a move to follow her, but his presence began to feel like a steady pressure. He was always perfectly composed, his movements slow and deliberate. He had the poise of an aristocrat, a quality that made him stand out even more against the busy, working-class energy of the port. Elena began to feel a sense of unease that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, but a nagging awareness that the rhythm of her life had been disrupted. She started taking different routes home and making sure her curtains were drawn as soon as she entered her apartment. The feeling of being watched was like a low-frequency hum that she couldn't tune out. She mentioned it to a friend at work, but they laughed it off, saying she probably just had an admirer from the shipping elite who was too shy to speak. The pressure reached a breaking point on a Thursday night. Elena was inside her apartment, preparing a light dinner of olives and bread. The wind was howling off the Aegean, rattling the window frames and making the velvet curtains sway. She heard a soft, rhythmic tapping at her door. It wasn't the frantic knock of an emergency, but a polite, measured sound, the kind of knock a gentleman might use. She froze her hand, gripping the kitchen knife, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved to the door and looked through the small glass peephole. The hallway was dimly lit, but she could see the man in the suit standing there. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and his silver-handled cane in the other. Even through the distorted glass, he looked incredibly calm. He leaned in slightly, and she heard a voice deep, warm, and perfectly articulated asking if she was Elena. The tone was so trustworthy and polite that she found her hand moving toward the lock. It is a legal and social reality of the time that in 1970s, Greece, a man of high status was rarely questioned or viewed with suspicion. Their clothes and their speech acted as a passport, granting them entry into spaces where others were barred. This gentlemanly veneer was a powerful tool, a way to bypass the natural instincts of caution that most people carry. For a young woman like Elena, the social pressure to be polite to a man of obvious importance was often stronger than the quiet voice of alarm in her head. Elena opened the door just a few inches. The man smiled, a slow and practiced gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. He explained that he was a friend of a colleague from the bank and had a message for her. His speech was elevated, filled with the formal turns of phrase used by the Greek upper class. As he spoke, Elena noticed that he was wearing a pair of pristine white silk gloves. They were so white they seemed to glow in the shadows of the hallway. Before she could react, he moved. The struggle was over before it truly began. The man was deceptively strong, his movements coordinated and precise. He didn't use a heavy weapon or a loud gun. He used a length of thin steel wire, the kind used for the high notes of a piano. The pressure was immediate and absolute. Elena felt a sudden numbing cold in her throat and a frantic heat in her chest as her lungs fought for air. She tried to reach for his face, but the silk of his gloves was smooth and slick, offering no grip. The neighbor in the apartment across the hall, a young man named Costas, was sitting at his desk when he heard a faint thud against the wall. He paused his reading, listening for a follow-up sound, but the building had returned to its usual silence. He thought it was probably just a heavy book falling or a piece of furniture being moved. A few minutes later, he heard the soft click of Elena's front door closing. He didn't think twice about it. People in the building often came and went at all hours. Costas walked to his window and looked down at the street. He saw a man in a dark suit walking away from the building, using a silver-handled cane to navigate the uneven cobblestones. The man moved with a grace that was almost poetic, his shoulders square and his pace unhurried. He looked like he had just stepped out of a theater after a successful performance. Costas watched him disappear into the mist of the harbor, never realizing that he was the only witness to a shadow that would haunt Piraeus for years. The next morning, the elderly woman from the first floor noticed that Elena's morning paper was still sitting in the hallway. By noon, the milk delivery was also untouched. Concerned, she contacted the building manager, who used his spare key to enter the apartment. The rooms were perfectly tidy, exactly as Elena had left them. There was no sign of a break-in and no evidence of a struggle. It wasn't until they moved into the bedroom that they found her lying on the bed, as if she were merely sleeping. The scene was chilling in its order. Elena was positioned on her back, her navy silk dress smoothed out and her hands folded neatly over her stomach. There was a single thin mark around her neck, but no other injuries. Most disturbingly, a pair of pristine white silk gloves had been placed on her chest, right over her heart. They were arranged as if they were a gift, a final touch of elegance left behind by a killer who viewed his crimes as a form of art. The Piraeus police were completely out of their depth. They had dealt with crimes of passion and dockside brawls, but they had never seen anything as calculated as the white glove murders. There were no fingerprints on the gloves, and the wire used to kill her was a common variety found in any music shop. The lead investigator, a veteran named Detective Pappas, spent days walking through the apartment trying to understand the mind of a man who would take the time to pose a body with such care. Pappas interviewed every shopkeeper and resident on the street. He heard the same story over and over: a man in a suit, a silver-handled cane, a deep and warm voice. But when he tried to find a suspect, he hit a wall of silence. The people of Piraeus couldn't imagine that someone from the high society circles they admired could be a killer. To them, crime was something that happened in the slums, not in the luxury apartments overlooking the harbor. The killer's appearance was his perfect camouflage. The investigation moved to the local tailors and clothing shops. Pappas found a small boutique that sold the specific brand of white silk gloves found at the scene. The tailor remembered a customer who had purchased several pairs a few weeks earlier. He described a man with impeccable taste and a voice that sounded like a cello. The customer had paid in cash and hadn't left a name, but the tailor recalled that he seemed to have a deep knowledge of classical music and Greek tragedy. A few months later, the port was gripped by fear again when 2 more women were found in their homes, murdered in the exact same manner. Each time the apartment was tidy, the body was posed and the white silk gloves were left behind. The Piraeus press began calling him the gentleman killer, a name that only increased the public's fascination and terror. The killer was treated like a phantom, a ghost who could move through the city's most secure spaces without leaving a trace. The twist in the case came from a detail that seemed insignificant at first. A witness from the third murder mentioned seeing a luxury car parked near the scene, a model that was only owned by a handful of people in the entire country. Pappas began to look into the art and music circles of Athens, suspecting that the killer might be traveling from the capital. He found a primary suspect, a wealthy patron of the arts who was known for his obsession with ritual and his frequent trips to the port. This suspect was a man who lived a double life, moving between the salons of Athens and the dark alleys of Piraeus. He was a narcissist who believed he was performing a grand tragedy, a play where the victims were merely players in his design. He used the lavender perfume and the white gloves to elevate his crimes, turning a brutal act into a poetic statement. But before Pappas could gather enough evidence to make an arrest, the suspect died in a high-speed car accident on the road to Athens. The crash was violent, the luxury vehicle spinning off a cliff and into the sea. When the wreckage was recovered, the investigators found a box in the trunk containing several lengths of piano wire and a stack of white silk gloves. The secret of why he chose those specific women and why he left the gloves died with him in the water. The case was officially closed, but for the people of Piraeus, the sense of safety that had defined their city in the 70s was gone forever. The reconstruction of the gentleman's method showed a predator who used psychology as much as physical force. He didn't just kill, he seduced the environment. He made himself belong in the spaces of his victims until their natural defenses were lowered. The lavender perfume was a sensory anchor, a way to mark the air with his presence before he even arrived. He was a man who understood that a well-tied tie and a polite greeting could be more dangerous than a knife in the dark. In 2024, the Hellenic Police Museum in Athens put the original white gloves from the Piraeus case on display for the first time in decades. Thousands of people came to see them standing in silence before the small glass case. Even after 50 years, the gloves still looked pristine, a stark white contrast against the red velvet of the display. Some visitors claimed they could still catch a faint, lingering scent of lavender in the air around the exhibit, a ghost of a killer who used elegance to hide his darkness. The harbor of Piraeus is still a place of deep water and long shadows. The tankers still move across the horizon, and the salt air still carries the sounds of the city's busy life. But if you walk through the residential districts on a misty winter night, you might notice that the people still check their locks twice. They remember the story of the man in the suit and the silver-handled cane. They know that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who knows exactly how to say your name. On the other side of the world, in a city where the sky stays gray for months, a different kind of silence was already waiting. It wasn't the silence of a tidy apartment or a posed body, but the suffocating quiet of a villa that had been erased from the map. In Saigon, the secrets of the past were being buried under the floorboards, and the only thing left behind to mark the spot was a single dried rose that had seen too much blood. The rain in Saigon during the late months of 1976 did not just fall. It hammered against the clay rooftops of the Cholon district with a relentless rhythmic weight that drowned out almost every other sound in the city. In the narrow alleys of District 5, the water pooled between ancient stones, reflecting the dim, flickering yellow lights of the few villas that still stood as remnants of a different time. Inside one of those villas, a massive structure of faded yellow plaster and heavy iron gates, the air was thick with the scent of damp limewash and old incense. The walls were nearly 3 feet thick, designed to keep out the humid tropical heat, but on a night like this, they seemed to hold the coldness of the rain instead. Everything was quiet inside, save for the steady, muffled drumming on the clay tiles far above. Mr. Lai was a man who understood the value of silence and the power of a well-placed secret. At 50 years old, he had lived through enough shifts in the city's power to know that survival often depended on what you did not say. He was a wealthy, ethnic Chinese merchant, a man whose influence was felt in the gold markets and the shipping lanes, long before the transition of 1975 changed the face of the country. To the people of Cholon, Mr. Lai was a figure of steady, quiet authority. He moved through the crowded markets with a measured pace, his silk shirts always pressed and his expression always neutral. He was a man of habit, anchored by the daily rituals of his business and the fortress-like security of his home. He believed that as long as he maintained his connections and kept his ledgers in order, he could navigate any storm. The villa itself was a testament to his success. It was filled with heavy rosewood furniture, delicate porcelain from the mainland, and a private safe that was rumored to hold a fortune in gold tails. Mr. Lai spent his evenings in his study, the light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls as he reviewed his accounts. He was a meticulous man, someone who counted every grain of rice and every ounce of gold with the same intensity. He was rarely alone in the house. His housekeeper, a woman who had been with the family for over 20 years, moved through the rooms like a silent shadow. She knew the creak of every floorboard and the weight of every key on Mr. Lai's heavy brass ring. There was a deep, wordless trust between them, a relationship built on decades of shared history and the common goal of maintaining the villa's perfect, untouchable order. The housekeeper's life was defined by the needs of the house. She rose before the sun to sweep the courtyard and stayed up late into the night to ensure that every door was bolted and every window was latched. She was the one who prepared Mr. Lai's tea and kept the incense burning in the family altar. To her, the villa was not just a workplace. It was a sanctuary that she defended with a quiet, fierce dedication. In the months following the end of the war, the atmosphere in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, was one of cautious adaptation. For the old elite, like Mr. Lai, the world was shrinking. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the past was being replaced by a more disciplined, scrutinized reality. He spent more time inside the villa, preferring the company of his books and his ledgers to the uncertain whispers of the streets. He felt the pressure of the changing times, a steady tightening of the social and economic landscape. Many of his old associates had already left the city, their departures sudden and often permanent. Mr. Lai stayed rooted by his assets and his belief that a man of his standing was essential to the city's recovery. He was a pillar of the old world, trying to find his footing in a landscape that was still shifting beneath his feet. Every evening, the housekeeper would bring a tray of tea to the study, the porcelain cups clinking softly as she set them down on the rosewood desk. They would exchange a few brief words about the household needs or the weather, and then she would retreat, leaving him to his thoughts. It was a rhythm that had survived wars and revolutions, a small pocket of normalcy in a city that was reinventing itself every day. Mrs. Lai, his wife, was often away visiting relatives in the countryside or attending to the family's smaller holdings. She was a woman of few words, possessing a sharp eye for detail and a deep understanding of her husband's complex business ties. When she was home, the villa felt more complete, her presence adding a layer of warmth to the cold, high-ceilinged rooms. But during this week, in late 1976, she was gone. The isolation of the villa was part of its charm for Mr. Lai. Behind the heavy iron gates and the thick plaster walls, he could pretend that the world outside had not changed quite so much. He surrounded himself with the smells of his youth, the scent of sandalwood, the aroma of fermented tea, and the clean, sharp smell of the rain on the stone courtyard. He was a man holding on to a version of the city that was slowly fading. On that final rainy night, the routine seemed to hold. The housekeeper had performed her rounds, checking the locks on the heavy front doors and ensuring the servants' quarters were secure. She brought the final tray of tea to the study at 8 o'clock, the warmth of the steam rising against the damp evening air. Mr. Lee nodded his thanks, his eyes never leaving, the document spread out before him on the desk. The rain intensified as the night wore on the sky, turning into a dark, suffocating curtain of water. The sounds of the street, the occasional chime of a bicycle bell, or the distant call of a vendor were completely swallowed by the storm. Inside the villa, the only light came from the study and the small lamp in the housekeeper's room. It was a night for staying inside, for closing the world out and waiting for the morning. The first offbeat detail occurred just before dawn. A neighborhood watchman making his rounds through the rain-slicked alleys of Cho Lan noticed that the massive iron gates of the Lai villa were standing open just a few inches. It was a small deviation, but in a house known for its fortress-like security, it was enough to make him stop. The gates were never left unbolted, especially not during a storm of this magnitude. He approached the gate, his boots splashing in the deep puddles. He called out, but his voice was lost in the wind. He noticed that the heavy brass lock was not broken. It was simply disengaged, as if someone had used a key and then forgotten to turn it back. He felt a sudden sharp coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the rain. He moved into the courtyard, the silence of the villa feeling heavy. As he entered the main house, the smell of damp lime wash was overwhelmed by something else, the faint metallic scent of blood. He found the housekeeper first lying in the hallway near the kitchen. She looked almost as if she had fallen asleep, but the dark pool spreading across the tiles told a different story. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no evidence that she had even seen her attacker. He moved toward the study, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling out into the dark hallway. Inside the scene was one of chilling precision. Mr. Lai was slumped over his desk, his hands still resting near his ledgers. He had been killed with a single professional strike, his life ending in the middle of a sentence. The watchman's eyes were drawn to the back of the room where the massive iron safe stood. He expected to see it blown open or mangled by tools, but it was wide open, the door swinging gently on its hinges. He stepped closer, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He looked inside and saw dozens of gold taels, enough to buy several villas, sitting untouched on the velvet-lined shelves. The killer had ignored the fortune. Instead, the safe was mostly empty of the documents Mr. Lai was known to keep. In their place, sitting right in the center of the middle shelf, was a single dried rose. It was deep red, almost black with age, and it was stained with a fresh, wet smear of blood. It was a cinematic, haunting calling card that turned a robbery into something far more personal and far more terrifying. The fortune was left as an insult. The police arrived within the hour, their heavy boots thudding across the rosewood floors. They were led by an investigator who had spent his career navigating the complex underworld of Saigon. He stood in the study, looking from the gold in the safe to the dried rose and then to the body of Mr. Lai. He realized immediately that this was not a crime of opportunity. It was a message delivered with surgical accuracy. The investigation moved through the villa with a frantic energy. They searched for fingerprints, for footprints in the mud of the courtyard, and for any sign of forced entry. They found nothing. The killer had moved through the house with the familiarity of a ghost, bypassing the locks and the security measures as if they didn't exist. It was clear that the person who did this knew exactly where the keys were kept. They questioned the neighbors, but the storm had provided the perfect cover. No one had seen a car, No one had heard a scream, and no one had noticed anything unusual until the watchman found the gate. The rain had washed away any tracks in the alley, leaving the police with a crime scene that was as clean as it was brutal. The Rose murder began to take shape as a legend of secrets and shadows. The investigator focused on the safe and the missing documents. He learned from Mrs. Lai, who had returned to the city in a state of shock, that her husband kept records of old debts, political alliances, and pre-war business deals that many people would have killed to keep quiet. The gold was trivial compared to the power contained in those papers. The rose was a signal that a debt had finally been settled. As they dug into Mr. Lai's past, they found a web of rivals and former associates who had reason to fear him. But each one had a perfect alibi, and none of them seemed capable of the level of professional skill displayed at the villa. The killer hadn't just taken the documents. They had performed a hit that required a deep knowledge of the house's layout and the merchant's most private habits. The twist came when the police analyzed the dried rose. It wasn't a local variety. It was a type of rose that had been popular in the colonial gardens of the old elite before the war. The blood on the petals matched Mr. Lai's, but the rose itself was years old, preserved with a level of care that suggested it was a memento of a specific event or a specific person from the merchant's past. The climax of the story arrived when the investigator realized that the killer didn't need to break in. They had been invited. The codes for the safe and the keys for the gate were only known to a handful of people, all of whom were supposedly far from the city that night. The realization that the danger had come from within Mr. Lai's own circle of trust turned the investigation into a hunt for a shadow. The reconstruction of the crime showed a killer who was an expert in close-quarters combat and psychological warfare. They had likely entered the villa hours before the storm reached its peak, waiting in the shadows of the high-ceilinged rooms for the perfect moment. They had moved with a silence that suggested they had practiced this specific act dozens of times in their mind. It was a hit based on a long-held grudge. The killer was likely a peer of Mr. Lai, someone who had been wronged during the chaotic years of the war and had waited for the perfect moment to strike. They didn't want the gold because they already had enough. They wanted the satisfaction of erasing Mr. Lai's legacy and reclaiming the secrets that had held them hostage. The rose was the final period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. In 2026, the villa in Cholan still stands, though it has been divided into several smaller apartments for local families. The yellow plaster is peeling and the iron gates are rusted shut, but the elders in District 5 still whisper about the night the safe was opened. They say that on rainy nights, you can still catch the faint, sweet scent of a dried rose mixing with the smell of the damp earth. The secrets of Mr. Lai were never recovered, and his killer was never identified. The documents likely burned in a fireplace somewhere in the city that same night, turning the history of Cholan's elite into ash and smoke. The case remains a locked room in the history of Saigon, a reminder that in a city of shadows, the things you leave behind can be more dangerous than the things you take. In Saigon, it was a dried rose left behind in an untouched safe. In Istanbul, it would be an heirloom diamond ring that went missing from a room that no one could have entered. But before we reach the Bosphorus, we have to look at the luxury apartments of Sarıyer, where a cup of coffee was left steaming on a table next to a body that shouldn't have been there. It was just after 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in 1977 when the mist began to crawl up from the Bosphorus, swallowing the base of the luxury apartment buildings in the Sarıyer district. Inside a fourth-floor unit, 34-year-old Layla stood in her kitchen listening to the rhythmic hiss of the blue flame on the stove. She was preparing a single cup of Turkish coffee, her movements precise and practiced as she measured the finely ground beans into a small copper pot. The apartment was silent, save for the distant, muffled sound of a foghorn out on the water. The kitchen was a space of cool marble and polished brass, reflecting the high status Layla and her husband maintained in Istanbul's diplomatic circles. High ceilings stretched upward into the shadows, and the air carried the faint, lingering scent of expensive French perfume and the cold, salty tang of the sea air coming through the vents. Layla adjusted her silk robe, the fabric smooth against her skin, and watched the dark liquid in the pot begin to foam. This was her favorite hour, the brief window of time when the social obligations of the day had finally ended. Layla's life was defined by the elegant, high-pressure world of international relations. As the wife of a high-ranking diplomatic official, her days were a constant series of lunches, charity events, and carefully orchestrated dinners where every word was measured. She was a woman who understood the importance of appearances, keeping her home as pristine and composed as she kept herself. To the outside world, she was a pillar of the Istanbul elite, a woman who moved through the city's most guarded spaces with a quiet, effortless grace that few could truly emulate. The apartment in Sarıyer was a fortress of sorts, located in one of the most heavily policed neighborhoods in the country. To reach the front door, a visitor had to pass through a gated courtyard and a manned lobby, and the unit itself was equipped with heavy iron bolts and a sophisticated alarm system that was rare for the time. Layla took pride in this security, viewing it as a necessary boundary between her private life and the growing political instability that was beginning to pulse through the streets of Istanbul. Her home was a sanctuary where the chaos of the city could not reach her. Her husband, a man of intense focus and long working hours, was often away at the consulate until late in the evening. This left Layla to manage the household and the staff, a task she performed with a mechanical efficiency. She was respected by the people who worked for her, but she remained somewhat distant, a woman who valued privacy above all else. Her routine was her armor, and she rarely deviated from the schedule she had set for herself years ago. She was a person who found comfort in the predictable, the stable, and the well-ordered world she had built. The most famous piece of that world was a diamond ring she wore on her right hand, an Ottoman heirloom that had been in her husband's family for generations. The stone was massive, a clear, brilliant cut that seemed to trap the light whenever she moved her hand. There were rumors in the village where the family originated that the ring carried a curse, a story that Layla dismissed with a polite, practiced smile. To her, the diamond was simply a symbol of her husband's lineage and the weight of the history she was now tasked with representing in the modern world. She often found herself staring at the stone while she waited for her coffee to brew, watching the way the blue flame reflected in its facets. The ring was heavy, a constant physical reminder of the expectations placed upon her. She was expected to be perfect, to be silent, and to be a reflection of her husband's success. In the quiet of the kitchen, she could allow herself to feel the weight of that responsibility, a pressure that never truly left her, even when she was alone. She was a woman who lived in a gilded cage, but she had learned to love the shine of the bars. Layla's relationship with the city was one of careful observation. From her balcony, she could see the lights of the tankers moving through the Bosphorus, a slow and steady parade of commerce and mystery. She loved the way the water looked at night, dark and impenetrable, holding the secrets of 1,000 years. Istanbul in 1977 was a place of deep shadows and sudden shifts, a city where the past and the future were constantly at war. Layla felt like she existed in the space between those two worlds, a witness to a transformation she didn't fully understand. She poured the coffee into a small porcelain cup, the dark liquid thick and aromatic. She took a moment to inhale the scent, a bitter and grounding smell that signaled the true beginning of her evening. She planned to sit by the window and watch the fog roll in a simple pleasure that required nothing from her but her presence. She was a woman who enjoyed her own company, finding a rare kind of peace in the silence of the large empty rooms. She picked up the saucer and began to walk toward the living area, her slippers silent on the thick Persian rugs. The living room was filled with antique furniture and heavy velvet curtains that were drawn tight against the night. The only light came from a single lamp in the corner, casting a warm amber glow over the room. Layla sat in her favorite armchair, a high-backed piece of mahogany and silk that faced the large glass doors. She set the coffee on the small table next to her, the steam rising in a thin vertical line. She felt a sense of profound calm, a feeling that for this 1 hour she was exactly where she was meant to be, protected and untouched. She reached out to pick up her cup, her diamond ring, catching the light and sending a sudden sharp flash across the wall. She paused, looking at the stone, and for a split second she thought she heard a sound from the hallway. It was a soft, rhythmic clicking, almost like the sound of a key turning in a lock, but it was too faint to be certain. She listened intently, her heart skipping a single beat, but the silence of the apartment returned heavy and absolute. She dismissed the thought, attributing it to the old building settling or the wind rattling the vents. The first offbeat detail happened a moment later. As she lifted the cup to her lips, Layla noticed that the flavor of the coffee was slightly different than usual. It had a faint herbal undertone, a botanical bitterness that sat at the very back of her throat. She frowned, looking down at the dark liquid, wondering if the housekeeper had purchased a different brand of beans or if the water had a metallic tang from the pipes. She took another small sip, trying to identify the taste, but the sensation in her mouth began to change. Within seconds, a strange numbing heat began to spread from her tongue to the roof of her mouth. It was a tingling sensation similar to the way a limb feels when it has fallen asleep, but it was moving with a terrifying speed. Layla tried to set the cup down, but her fingers felt heavy and unresponsive. Her hand trembled the porcelain, clattering against the saucer with a sharp, frantic sound that seemed loud in the quiet room. She tried to stand up, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the floor by a force she couldn't understand. The pressure in her chest intensified, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She felt a sudden sharp dizziness, the room beginning to tilt and blur at the edges. She tried to call out for the housekeeper, who slept in a small room near the kitchen, but her vocal cords felt paralyzed her voice, nothing more than a faint, raspy whisper. The herbal bitterness was now a fire in her throat, a chemical heat that seemed to consume her from the inside out. She realized with a cold mounting dread that something was profoundly wrong, but she was trapped within her own body. She slumped back into the armchair, her head lolling to the side. Through the haze of her fading vision, she watched the steam continue to rise from the coffee cup. It was a peaceful sight, a domestic detail that stood in haunting contrast to the violence happening within her nervous system. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, a heavy and deliberate thud in her ears that seemed to count down the seconds. She was aware of the silence of the apartment, a silence that now felt like a predatory weight pressing down on her as the light in the room began to dim. It was nearly midnight when Layla's husband returned home from the consulate. He moved through the lobby and the gated courtyard with the tired, efficient gait of a man who had spent the day in high-stakes negotiations. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, the metallic hum of the machinery, the only sound in the hallway. He pulled his heavy brass key from his pocket and inserted it into the lock, but the door wouldn't budge. He frowned, trying the handle again, realizing that the internal iron bolt had been thrown from the inside. He knocked loudly, calling Layla's name, but there was no response. He assumed she had fallen asleep in the living room and had accidentally engaged the security latch, a habit she occasionally had when she felt particularly tired. He walked down the hall to the housekeeper's entrance, but that door was also bolted tight. He felt the first sharp spark of alarm in his chest, a sudden awareness of the silence behind the heavy wood. He called out again, his voice echoing in the hallway, but the only sound he heard was the distant foghorn from the Bosphorus. He hurried back to the lobby and found the building manager, his face pale and his hands shaking. Together they returned to the 4th floor with a set of heavy tools. It took them nearly 20 minutes to force the reinforced diplomatic door, the wood finally splintering with a violent, echoing crack. They stepped into the hallway, the air inside the apartment feeling unnervingly still. The husband moved toward the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He called her name one last time, but the silence remained absolute. The husband found Layla exactly where she had been sitting. She was slumped in the high-backed armchair, her head resting against the silk upholstery. At first glance, she looked like she had simply passed away in her sleep, her expression neutral and her silk robe perfectly arranged. But as he got closer, he noticed the small, dark bruises on her neck, faint marks that suggested a professional clinical strangulation. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against the cold, still skin, and he realized with a shock that the heirloom diamond ring was gone. The investigation was led by a senior detective from the Istanbul police, who specialized in high-profile crimes. He stood in the center of the living room, looking from the body to the coffee cup, which was still sitting on the side table. He noticed that the coffee was still slightly warm, suggesting that the event had happened only a short time before the husband arrived. He examined the windows and the doors, finding that every single one was bolted from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no evidence of a break-in. The detective was a man who believed in the logic of physics, but the scene in Sarriere defied every law of the trade. It was a classic locked-room mystery, a crime that shouldn't have been possible. He questioned the building manager and the security staff, but no one had seen any strangers enter the building. The elevator records showed no unusual activity, and the balcony was a sheer drop of 40 feet to a patrolled courtyard. He felt a sense of growing frustration, a feeling that he was chasing a shadow that could move through solid walls. Toxicology reports eventually confirmed that the coffee contained traces of a rare paralyzing herb found in the high Anatolian mountains. The plant was known to cause immediate muscle failure and respiratory distress, but it was almost impossible to find in a modern city like Istanbul. The detective realized that the killer was someone with a deep knowledge of botany and pharmacology, a person who had calculated the dosage with a surgical precision. The victim had been alive and conscious during the attack, but she had been unable to move a single muscle to defend herself. The twist in the case came when the detective began to examine the ventilation system of the apartment. He noticed that the vents in the kitchen and the living room were larger than standard, designed to move air quickly through the high-ceilinged spaces. He brought in a forensic architect who discovered that a small, highly trained individual could theoretically navigate the crawl spaces between the units. The architect found a single faint smudge of grease near the living room vent, a mark that was too small to be a fingerprint but suggested a physical presence. The theory of the ghost assassin began to circulate through the police department. The detective believed that a professional had utilized the vents to enter the apartment, waiting in the shadows for Layla to drink the coffee. The killer would have had to duplicate the housekeeper's keys to gain access to the service areas of the building, a feat of planning that suggested a high level of institutional support. The goal hadn't just been the diamond ring. It had been a demonstration of total undetectable access to one of the most secure homes in the city. The climax of the investigation occurred when the detective realized that the housekeeper had been drugged with a sedative on the night of the murder. She had slept through the entire event, her memory of the evening a total blank. This confirmed that the killer had been inside the house long before Layla made her coffee. The killer had been a silent witness to her entire evening routine, waiting in the crawl space or a darkened room for the exact moment when the paralyzing agent took hold. The danger had been living inside the walls for hours. The reconstruction of the crime showed a predator who operated with the cold efficiency of a machine. The killer had slipped through the vent, moved to the side table, and taken the ring while Layla was still conscious but unable to speak. The final act of strangulation was likely a mercy or a way to ensure no testimony could ever be given, performed with a clinical lack of emotion. The killer then exited the same way they entered, bolting the front door from the inside before disappearing back into the darkness of the building's structure. This level of professional skill suggested a state-sponsored hit or a highly organized criminal group with deep roots in the diplomatic world. The motive for taking the Ottoman ring was never fully understood. Some believed it was a political message, while others thought it was a targeted theft meant to look like an impossibility. The killer was a ghost, a person who understood the architecture of the building and the physiology of the human body perfectly. They had turned a luxury sanctuary into a tomb without leaving a single footprint in the dust. In 2026, the Serrier apartment remains empty, the heavy velvet curtains still drawn against the mist of the Bosphorus. The diplomatic official moved out shortly after the investigation stalled, and the unit has never been rented again. Locals believe that the locked energy of the crime still permeates the walls, a feeling of being watched that no amount of renovation can erase. The Ottoman ring has never appeared on the black market or in a private collection, leading many to believe it was destroyed or buried with the secrets of 1977. The detective who led the case retired without ever finding his ghost. He often sits in the cafes near the water, looking up at the shuttered windows of the fourth floor, wondering if the killer is still out there, moving through the hidden spaces of the city. He knows that in a place like Istanbul, the past is never truly gone. It just waits in the shadows for someone to turn their back. The story of Layla remains a cautionary tale for the night crew, a reminder that the most secure room in the world is only as safe as the people who have the keys. There is a specific kind of fear that comes with being watched in a crowd, a feeling that the person behind you knows exactly where you are going. But that fear is nothing compared to the realization that the walls themselves might be keeping a record of your every move. On a winter train in Romania, the space was even tighter, and the surveillance was even more intense. In a first-class carriage, a man was about to discover that some blueprints are worth more than a life, and some killers don't need a door to get inside. The rhythmic metallic clatter of wheels against frozen iron rails was the only song playing in the Bucharest train station on a sub-zero night in 1977. Stefan stood on the platform, his breath blooming in thick white clouds that vanished into the dark. He gripped the handle of a leather briefcase, the cold of the metal seeping through his gloves. Everything around him smelled of coal smoke and rusted steel. The station was a cathedral of gray concrete and iron, a place where every footstep felt like it was being recorded by the shadows. He watched the steam from the locomotive curl around the pillars, obscuring the faces of the silent commuters. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, but Stefan didn't move to find warmth. He was a man used to the harsh winters of Romania, a man whose life had been forged in the workshops and drafting rooms of the state. He stood with his back straight, his eyes fixed on the carriage marked for first-class travel. He was not just a passenger tonight, he was a guardian of a secret that the regime had spent 3 years building. Stefan grew up in a world of blueprints and cold iron. His father had been a railway mechanic, and from a young age, Stefan had learned to read the language of machines. He could tell the health of a steam engine by the rhythm of its pistons or the smell of the grease. At 30, he was no longer the boy in the workshop, but a man of influence tasked with designing the systems that would carry the nation into the next decade. He moved with a quiet, focused energy, his hands always smelling faintly of ink and engine oil. He lived in a small third-floor apartment in a concrete block that looked exactly like every other building in his district. It was a space of gray walls and high ceilings, but inside his wife Elena had created a pocket of warmth. She filled the rooms with the scent of dried flowers and the soft, steady ticking of a wooden clock. To Stefan, the apartment was the only place where he didn't feel the weight of the ministry's gaze. It was a sanctuary of tea and quiet conversation, a place where he could finally set down the burden of his talent. Their mornings were a sequence of quiet, practiced movements. Elena would boil water for tea on the small gas stove, the blue flame, the only light in the kitchen before the sun rose. They rarely spoke during breakfast, not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence was their way of protecting the peace they had built. Stefan would watch the steam rise from his cup, his mind already drifting toward the complex math of his day. He loved the way the morning light hit the old wooden table, making the grain of the wood look like a landscape. On the morning he was set to leave for the north, the tension in the kitchen was more pronounced than usual. Stefan spent a few extra minutes checking the lock on his briefcase, his fingers tracing the grain of the leather. Elena stood by the window, her hand resting on the cold glass as she watched the gray streets below. She knew that this project was different, that the blueprints he carried were more than just designs for a bridge. She saw the way his shoulders were held tight, the way he looked at the door before he had even reached it. He put on his heavy wool coat, the fabric still smelling of the wood smoke from the previous winter. Elena adjusted his collar, her fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary. She didn't ask him when he would be back, and he didn't offer a promise. In 1977, Romania words were a liability that neither of them could afford. He kissed her cheek, a brief and grounding contact before stepping out into the cold hallway. He could hear the echo of his own boots on the concrete stairs, a sound that felt louder than it should have. The walk to the ministry was a journey through a landscape of concrete and shadow. Stefan kept his head down, his chin tucked into the collar of his coat to block out the biting wind. He passed the bread lines and the gray-faced commuters, all of them moving with the same focused internal energy. He felt the eyes of the city on him, not just the people, but the buildings themselves, which seemed to lean in to hear his footsteps. He walked past the massive government monuments, their stone faces indifferent to the cold or the lives moving beneath them. At the ministry, his office was a cramped space filled with the smell of ammonia and old paper. Thousands of sheets of vellum were stacked on the shelves, holding the collective knowledge of the state's engineers. Stefan worked at a drafting table that had belonged to his mentor, the wood scarred by decades of compass points and ink spills. He felt a sense of continuity there, a feeling that he was just one link in a very long chain of builders. He spent his days lost in the geometry of progress, finding a rare kind of peace in the logic of a well-drawn line. The colonel from state security visited him twice that week, his heavy boots echoing on the cold linoleum floor. The office was a narrow tunnel of gray filing cabinets, the only light, the flickering fluorescent tube overhead that buzzed like a dying insect. Stefan felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, despite the wind chill. He stared at the leather briefcase and realized that for the first time in his life, he was afraid of his own work. The colonel didn't need to speak. The weight of his presence was enough to make the air in the room feel thin and dangerous. The blueprints for the bridge were the result of 3 years of constant pressure and late-night calculations. They represented a feat of engineering that would span the northern valleys, a structure of steel and concrete that would move military hardware as easily as it moved grain. Stefan had checked every bolt and every stress point 1,000 times. He knew the bridge in his mind as intimately as he knew the lines on his own palm. To him, the design was perfect, a silent monument to his own dedication and the resources of the nation. He spent the afternoon packing the final set of drawings, the paper crisp and smelling of fresh ink. He used a heavy silk ribbon to bind them, a small touch of elegance that seemed out of place in the sterile office. He placed them in the center of the briefcase and turned the dial on the lock, the metallic click signaling the end of his work. He felt a brief moment of relief, a sense that the creation was finally finished, and now all that remained was the journey through the dark countryside. He took one last look at his drafting table before turning out the light. The decision to take the express train was a matter of protocol. It was the flagship of the National Railway, a moving symbol of the regime's power. It was staffed by the most loyal conductors and watched by the most trusted guards. To Stefan, the train felt like a fortress on wheels, a closed environment where the variables were controlled and the risks were minimized. He believed that the tracks would carry him safely to the north, away from the prying eyes of the city and toward the completion of his mission. He trusted the iron and the steam. He arrived at the Bucharest station just as the sun was setting the sky, turning a deep bruised purple. The air was filled with the rhythmic clanging of metal and the high-pitched hiss of steam from the locomotives. He moved through the crowd with his head up, holding the briefcase tight against his side. He was a man of the state on a mission of importance, and for a few minutes he felt the pride that came with that distinction. He watched the massive engine pull into the station, its black steel gleaming under the yellow lights of the platform. The first-class carriage was a place of polished mahogany and brass fittings, a relic of a more opulent era that had been repurposed for the new elite. Stefan found his cabin and pushed the heavy sliding door open. The room was small but comfortable, with a single velvet seat and a small table under the window. He sat down and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate as the train lurched forward. The sound of the wheels began to build a steady grounding rhythm that told him he was finally on his way. He watched the station lights fall away, replaced by the dark outlines of the city's outskirts and the endless fields of snow. The rhythmic swaying of the carriage was soothing, a steady back and forth that felt like the heartbeat of the machine. Stefan reached into his bag and pulled out a small book of poetry, hoping to distract his mind from the weight of the briefcase. He settled into the luxury of the quiet space, listening to the hum of the heater and the muffled sounds of the guards in the hallway. He believed that the night would be quiet. The heater in the corner hummed with a low mechanical drone, blowing a stream of dry, warm air that smelled faintly of copper and dust. Stefan adjusted the vent, trying to find a balance between the heat and the chill of the window glass. He looked at his reflection in the dark pane, seeing a man who looked older than his 30 years. He was tired, but he was also proud. In a few hours, the blueprints would be out of his hands, and his work would be a part of the landscape. He leaned his head back against the velvet and closed his eyes. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the cabin was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the sliding door. Stefan sat up, his heart skipping a beat as he looked at the wooden panel. He assumed it was the ticket inspector making his rounds, or perhaps a guard checking the security of the first-class carriage. He reached for his briefcase, pulling it closer to his chest, and waited for the person to speak or enter. The train was moving at full speed, the sound of the wheels a constant white noise roar in the background. Instead of a voice, he heard a strange, high-pitched hissing sound coming from the ceiling. It was the sound of air being forced through a narrow opening, a steady whistle that grew louder with every passing second. Stefan looked up at the ventilation grate, his eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the noise. He thought perhaps the heater was failing, or a steam line had ruptured, but the air coming from the vent suddenly felt different. It was heavy and cold, carrying a sharp chemical odor that didn't belong in the first-class compartment. The smell hit him a second later, a sterile metallic scent that reminded him of a laboratory or a hospital. It was not the smell of coal smoke or dust, but something engineered. Stefan felt a sudden numbing sensation in his fingers, and his vision began to blur at the edges. He tried to stand up to reach for the door handle, but his legs felt like they were made of lead, refusing to obey his commands. He realized with a jolt of panic that he was losing control of his body. The world around him began to tilt, the velvet walls closing in. He tried to shout for the guards in the hallway, but his vocal cords felt paralyzed, his voice nothing more than a faint, raspy whisper that was swallowed by the roar of the train. He slumped back against the upholstery, his eyes fixed on the ventilation grate as the hissing sound continued. He was aware of the rhythmic clanging of the wheels, a sound that now felt distant and hollow, as if it were happening to someone else. He was trapped in a room that was filling with an invisible weight, a cold gray fog that was pulling him down into the floor. The last thing Stefan saw before his vision failed entirely was the shadow of a hand moving across the frosted glass of his cabin door. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a silhouette that didn't seem to belong to the guards or the inspector. He tried to reach for the briefcase one last time, his fingers brushing against the cold leather, but his arm fell limp at his side. The world faded into a cold, dark gray, leaving him alone with the sound of the hissing gas and the relentless rhythm of the rails. He felt a sudden sharp pressure, and then nothing. The ticket inspector finished his rounds of the second-class carriages and moved into the first-class car just after 2:30. The hallway was empty, the only sound, the steady hum of the engine and the creaking of the wooden walls as the train navigated a long curve. He stopped at Stefan's door and knocked 3 times, his leather gloves making a dull thud against the wood. He expected an immediate answer as the passenger was a man of importance, but the cabin remained silent. He felt a sudden sharp unease, a feeling that the air in the hall had grown thin. He leaned his ear against the door and heard a strange rhythmic scratching from inside, like a heavy weight being dragged across the carpet. He called out Stefan's name, his voice sounding desperate in the narrow hallway, but the only response was the steady clatter of the wheels. He tried the handle, but the internal bolt had been thrown from the inside, a safety measure that was now a barrier. The inspector signaled to a security officer at the end of the hall, his face pale in the dim yellow light of the carriage. Something was wrong. The officer didn't hesitate. He used a heavy shoulder to force the sliding door open, the wood splintering with a sharp metallic crack. As the door swung back, a cloud of cold, chemical-smelling gas rushed out into the hallway, making the men cough and shield their eyes. The cabin appeared empty, the velvet seat unoccupied and the small table cleared of its poetry book. The window was still locked from the inside and the leather briefcase was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the passenger and his secret had simply evaporated into the frozen night air. The officer moved into the room, his flashlight cutting through the lingering haze of the gas. He noticed that the carpet had been pulled back from the corner, revealing a small square maintenance panel in the floorboards that was slightly ajar. He knelt down and looked into the dark gap, expecting to see wires or plumbing. Instead, his light fell on the body of Stefan, wedged into the narrow opening with a chilling, clinical precision. He was folded into a space no more than 10 inches deep, his limbs twisted at angles that no living body could sustain. Stefan's torso had been compressed, as if by a massive weight, his ribs shattered into 1,000 fragments that shifted under the officer's touch. Sitting right in the center of the velvet seat, as if it were a guest waiting for the return of the passenger, was a single playing card. It was a joker, its grinning face looking up at the officer with a mocking, silent intensity. The inspector reached for it, his hands trembling. The blueprints were missing, and the only thing left in the cabin was the sound of the wind howling past the locked window. The state security cordoned off the entire station as the train pulled in 3 hours later. They brought in an elite forensic team that specialized in chemical warfare and deep cover assassinations. The autopsy of Stefan confirmed that he had been paralyzed by a specialized gas before being physically crushed into the floor by a professional with nearly superhuman strength. There were no bruises on his skin, suggesting the force had been applied evenly and with a tool designed for the task. The killer had operated with the efficiency of a machine. The investigators interviewed every guard and inspector, but no one had seen anyone enter or leave the first-class carriage. The train was a moving fortress, and the hallway was supposed to be a dead end for any intruder. The lead detective spent days studying the blueprints of the carriage, trying to understand how a human being could have moved through the walls of the train without being detected. He felt like he was chasing a ghost, a predator that could melt into the very structure of the National Railway and disappear at will. The detective discovered that the maintenance crawlspace ran the entire length of the train, a hidden artery designed for engineers to access the mechanical systems. It was a space so small that the regime's own safety manuals declared it impassable for a person of average size. But the killer hadn't been an average person. The detective found a single black synthetic fiber near the ventilation grate that didn't match any official uniform. It was a low-friction material designed for moving through tight spaces without making a sound. This was the twist that changed the investigation. The fiber was used only by elite military units for high-risk infiltrations. The killer hadn't used the hallway because he had been living inside the walls of the train for the entire journey. He was a professional who knew the architecture of the carriage better than the men who built it. He had been watching Stefan through the grates, waiting for the cover of the night and the paralyzing gas to do its work. The predator was a part of the train, a shadow that moved when the machine moved. The Joker card was identified as a wild card marker, a signal used by the Ghost Squad to signify a successful hit that left no evidence for the conventional authorities. The killer was an operative who didn't exist on any payroll or register. He was a shadow trained by the regime's own secret intelligence to eliminate targets who had become liabilities. Stefan hadn't been killed by a foreign spy or a common thief. He had been erased by the very power he was trying to serve. The blueprints were not stolen. They were simply taken back by the state. The climax of the investigation happened in a secret hearing at the ministry. The detective presented his findings about the hidden panel and the specialized gas, only to be met with a cold, absolute silence from the colonel. He realized that the bridge design was never meant to be public, and Stefan's knowledge of the structure was considered a security risk. The ghost train wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a clinical, state-sanctioned erasure. The detective was told to burn his files and forget the name of the man who lived in the floorboards. The killer had likely boarded the train as part of the maintenance crew, slipping into the crawl space with his gas canisters and waiting for the target to settle into his cabin. He had moved with a silence that suggested years of practice in confined spaces, his body becoming a part of the train's mechanical rhythm. He had used the paralyzing agent to ensure Stefan couldn't fight back, then used a specialized compression tool to pack the victim into the floor before retreating back into the darkness. He was a ghost who served the machine. This was a man who lived in the narrow gaps of the world, a predator who saw the architecture of society as a series of hiding spots. He had no name and no face that would ever appear in a police file. He took the blueprints and vanished into the gray winter of Bucharest, leaving behind only the shattered ribs of an engineer and a grinning card. His method was built on the absolute certainty that no one ever looks behind their own walls. He was the wild card, the piece of the puzzle that was never meant to be found by the light. The detective spent weeks reviewing the blueprints of every carriage in the national fleet. He discovered that the crawl spaces were not just accidental gaps, but deliberate design features requested by the state for discreet monitoring of high-value passengers. The train was never just a means of transport. It was a mobile surveillance lab. Every first-class cabin was a trap waiting for the right bait. This realization made the air in the ministry feel even colder, a reminder that in a fortress, every wall has an ear and every floor has a secret. He tracked the source of the synthetic fibers to a closed textile mill that only produced gear for the internal security forces. Every lead he followed ended in a locked door or a redacted file. He knew that by continuing his investigation, he was putting his own name on a list that no one ever wanted to be on. He eventually buried his notes in a garden far from the reach of the secret police, hoping that one day the truth would breathe. He left the city that summer, moving to a small village where the only things that moved were the trees. In 2025, leaked state security files finally confirmed the existence of the Ghost Squad and their involvement in the Bucharest ghost train murder. The blueprints were never recovered, but the case remains a legend among internet detectives as one of the most perfect hits of the era. The carriage itself was scrapped long ago, but some people claim that on the night express you can still hear a faint, high-pitched hissing in the vents. It is a sound that reminds the travelers to stay awake and to always look twice at the shadow in the hall. On the other side of the world, in a city where the air is a thick blanket of heat and exhaust, a different kind of silence was beginning to settle over the water. The gold merchants of Bangkok understood that prosperity often came with a price that wasn't listed on any ledger. In a place where the river fog can hide an entire car in seconds, a merchant was about to discover that the most dangerous roads are the ones that have no end. Sometimes the most valuable thing you carry is the one thing you can never trade for your life. It was a Tuesday night in 1977 when the fog rolled off the Chao Phraya River, turning the Rama 6 bridge into a gray, featureless tunnel. Somchai, a 42-year-old man known for his sharp eyes and steady hands, sat behind the wheel of his black Mercedes-Benz. The engine hummed with a quiet, expensive vibration, its headlights cutting only a few feet into the thick, damp haze. He was alone, his car the only one moving on that stretch of the bridge, surrounded by the smell of salt and diesel. The water below the bridge moved with a slow, heavy energy, its surface invisible beneath the blanket of mist. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of humidity that sticks to the skin and makes every breath feel like a physical effort. Somchai adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers tracing the smooth leather. He was a man who appreciated the engineering of his vehicle, the way it isolated him from the chaos of the city. To him, the car was a sanctuary, a private space where he could finally think. To the merchants in Bangkok's Yaowarat district, Somchai was a man who had built his own fortune from the dust of the streets. He ran one of the most successful gold shops in Chinatown, a place where the air always smelled of charcoal and molten metal. He spent his days behind a heavy glass counter, his loupe fixed to his eye, as he examined the purity of gold necklaces and heavy bracelets. He was a pillar of the community, a man who believed that hard work and honesty were the only true currency. The gold shop was a world of its own, a space of bright yellow lights and the rhythmic clicking of counting beads. Somchai moved through the store with a quiet authority, his presence enough to calm even the most frantic customer. He knew the history of every piece of jewelry he sold, the stories of the families who had traded their heirlooms for a new start. He was a meticulous man, someone who valued the precision of the scale and the absolute certainty of a well-documented transaction. He was an expert with the loupe, capable of spotting a microscopic flaw in a bar of bullion from across the room. He took pride in the fact that no one had ever successfully cheated him, not because he was suspicious, but because he was observant. He viewed the gold as a physical record of the city's life, a substance that never changed even as the government and the economy shifted around it. To Somchai, the metal was the only thing in the world that was truly honest and predictable. His standing in the Chinatown community was built on decades of small, fair deals. He was the man the other shopkeepers went to when they needed a second opinion or a short-term loan to cover a shipment. He didn't seek out the spotlight, preferring to lead from the shadows of his office, but his influence was felt in every corner of the district. He was a man who understood that in a city like Bangkok, a good reputation was more valuable than any amount of gold stored in a safe. Somchai lived for his family, his wife, and 3 children who waited for him in their quiet home on the outskirts of the city. He was a man of habit, following the same route every day, his black Mercedes, a familiar sight to the street vendors who sold noodles along the way. He took pride in the safety he had provided for them, believing that his success was a shield that would protect his loved ones from the political instability and social unrest that was pulsing through Thailand. The black Mercedes-Benz was more than just a status symbol. It was his primary safe space. He had purchased it with the profits from a particularly successful year, and he maintained it with a level of care that bordered on obsession. He loved the weight of the doors and the absolute silence of the cabin when the windows were rolled up. It was the one place where he didn't have to be the merchant or the community leader. He could just be a man driving home to his family in the cool evening. One of his most consistent routines involved the transportation of gold scrap. Every few weeks he would gather the small clippings and broken pieces of jewelry into a nondescript leather bag to be taken for refining. He never carried it in an armored truck. He believed that anonymity was his best defense. To anyone else, he was just a successful businessman heading home for dinner. He felt a quiet satisfaction in the weight of the bag on the back seat, a tangible reminder of the day's labor. The political climate of 1977 was starting to weigh on the merchant, but he didn't show it to his neighbors. The city was on edge, filled with rumors of government reshuffling and police crackdowns, but inside the gold shop, the world remained stable. Somchai was a man who understood the value of silence. He kept his head down and his books in order, believing that if he didn't attract the attention of the powerful, he would be left alone to enjoy his life. He often spoke to his wife about the future, about the day when they could retire to a quiet farm, far from the noise and the heat of the city. He wanted his children to have a world where they didn't have to count every gram of gold to be sure of their safety. He was a dreamer in a pragmatic world, a man who worked with his hands but lived in his mind. He He believed that the path he was on was the only way to reach that farm, a steady and deliberate climb toward a peaceful horizon. On his final morning at the shop, the routine was exactly as it had been for 20 years. He arrived at 8 o'clock, unlocked the heavy iron gates, and began the process of setting the displays. He chatted with the neighboring tea seller, discussing the rising price of charcoal and the humidity of the coming season. He looked at his shop with a sense of pride, the polished glass and the gleaming metal, a testament to his life's work. There was nothing in the air to suggest the day was unique. He spent the afternoon reviewing the refining documents, the paper crisp and smelling of fresh ink. He carefully placed the gold scrap into the leather bag, the metallic clinking of the pieces, a familiar and grounding sound. He locked the safe, turned out the lights, and stepped into the humid evening air. He nodded to the night watchman, a man he had known for a decade, and climbed into the Mercedes. He was tired, but it was the good kind of exhaustion that comes from a productive day. He started the engine, the low hum of the machine, a comforting vibration in the seat of his pants. He enjoyed the smell of the leather and the cool air from the vents as he navigated the crowded streets of Chinatown. The neon signs of the city blurred past him, a kaleidoscope of red and yellow that reflected in the polished hood of the car. He felt a sense of relief as he reached the outskirts of the district, and the traffic began to thin, allowing him to accelerate toward the bridge. As he entered the Rama 6 bridge, the fog was thicker than he had ever seen it. It was a solid wall of gray that seemed to absorb the light from his headlamps, leaving him in a world of muted shadows. He slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes fixed on the white line at the edge of the asphalt. The sound of the city was completely gone, replaced by the muffled roar of the river below. He felt a sudden, sharp sensation of being entirely alone in the world, a ghost in a machine. The nature of the fog that night was predatory. It didn't just obscure the view. It seemed to press against the glass of the car, a damp and heavy presence that made the air inside the cabin feel cold. Samchai turned on the defroster, the warm air hissing against the windshield, but the mist remained. He felt a brief spark of unease, a feeling that the road ahead was no longer the one he knew. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white in the dim light of the dashboard. A fisherman sitting on the bank of the river later reported seeing the headlights of the Mercedes pause in the middle of the bridge for an unusually long time. He was a man used to the rhythms of the water, a person who spent his nights in the silence of the reeds. He watched as the yellow beams flickered, then remained stationary, casting a blurry glow into the gray air. He waited for the sound of a horn or the roar of the engine as it pulled away, but the bridge remained silent. The fisherman watched as the driver's side door of the car swung open to its full extent. The interior light of the vehicle was a bright white square against the gray background of the mist. He saw a single figure step out from the car, a tall silhouette that moved with a stiff, unnatural gait. The person walked toward the rear of the vehicle and then vanished into the wall of fog. He waited for the figure to return, but the door remained open, a dark gash in the center of the light. He felt a sudden cold dread in the pit of his stomach that had nothing to do with the night air. In a city like Bangkok, a luxury car left idling on a bridge was rarely a simple mechanical failure. He stood up, his eyes straining to see through the haze, but the bridge had become a silent stage. He didn't hear a splash in the water, and he didn't hear the sound of footsteps on the pavement. There was only the low mechanical drone of the engine and the distant sound of the city. The silence that followed was absolute. The fisherman stayed where he was for nearly 10 minutes, his mind racing through the possibilities of what he had just seen. He thought about calling out, but he was afraid of the voice that might answer from the fog. He eventually packed up his gear and moved toward the nearest road, his pace quick and his head down. He knew that some things were better left to the shadows, but the image of the open door remained burned into his mind. When the police arrived at the scene 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of their motorcycles were the only things that could cut through the mist. They found the black Mercedes-Benz exactly where the fisherman had seen it, the engine still running and the heater still blowing. The driver's door was wide open, exposing the empty leather seat to the damp night air. It looked as if the driver had simply stepped out for a moment and had forgotten to come back. The scene inside the car was a picture of a life interrupted. On the back seat, the leather bag of gold scrap had been overturned, the yellow pieces scattered across the dark carpet like fallen leaves. There was no blood on the upholstery and no sign of a struggle, but the presence of the gold suggested that whoever had been in the car had not left by choice. A merchant like Somchai would never have left his fortune behind, especially not in a place as public as the middle of a bridge. The idling engine was a mechanical detail that felt haunting to the officers. The machine was doing exactly what it was designed to do, maintaining a perfect environment for a passenger who was no longer there. The smell of the exhaust mixed with the salty tang of the river mist, creating a heavy industrial odor that hung over the bridge. The lead officer reached into the car and turned the key, the sudden silence of the engine feeling like a heavy weight dropping onto the asphalt. Captain Prassett led the investigation with a focus that bordered on obsession. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to find a body, and he refused to believe that a man could simply evaporate into the fog. He ordered divers into the Chao Phraya River, convinced that Somchai had either jumped or been pushed over the railing. For 3 weeks, the teams combed the murky depths around the concrete pillars, battling the powerful currents and the debris of the city. The search of the river was a total failure. The divers found old tires, pieces of rusted iron, and the remains of a sunken boat, but they found no trace of the gold merchant. There were no marks on the bridge railing that would suggest a body had gone over, and the water at the base of the pillars was undisturbed. The captain began to realize that the river was not the answer. He felt a growing sense of frustration, a feeling that the merchant had been taken by something else. He spent the next month checking Somchai's bank accounts and interviewing his rivals in the gold trade. He found that the merchant was a man of impeccable standing with no debts and no known enemies who would be capable of such a calculated act. Every lead he followed ended in the same gray wall of silence. The neighbors described a man who was devoted to his family and his business, someone who would never stage a disappearance or abandon his children. The mystery deepened. The family of the merchant lived in a state of suspended grief. They kept the dinner table set for him every night, the chair at the head of the table empty but waiting. His wife spent her days at the consulate and the police station demanding answers that no one seemed able to give. She refused to believe he was dead, clinging to the hope that he had simply been taken and was waiting for a ransom that never came. The silence from the kidnappers was the hardest part to bear. The twist in the case came a year later when Captain Prassett was abruptly dismissed from the police force. The official reason was a reorganization of the department, but the rumors in the station were about a high-level bribery scandal. As his successor took over the gold merchant's file, they discovered that several key witness statements had been missing, and the original forensic photos of the car had been destroyed. The investigation had been deliberately hollowed out from the inside. The new investigator found a memo hidden in a separate folder that mentioned a second vehicle. A witness who had been crossing the bridge from the opposite direction had reported seeing an unmarked van parked just a few feet behind the Mercedes. The van had no lights on and was obscured by the fog. The witness had seen 2 men in dark uniforms stepping out of the van just before the driver's door of the Mercedes opened. This information had never been included in the official report. The realization that the locked bridge disappearance was likely a state-sanctioned extraction changed the entire meaning of the case. The fisherman's description of the tall figure and the stiff gait matched the training of a specialized military unit that was active in the city at the time. The merchant hadn't jumped into the river. He had been moved from one vehicle to another in the span of 30 seconds, hidden by the very mist that had made the bridge feel like a sanctuary. The climax of the mystery arrived when the investigator tracked down the original witness, who was now living in a different province. He described a coordinated movement, a hit that was executed with the precision of a drill. The men in the van had moved with total authority, not even bothering to hide their faces. They had taken Somchai and his bag of gold, leaving the Mercedes idling as a distraction for any passerby. The bridge was not a crime scene, it was a handover point. The truth was that Somchai had become a target of a political purge disguised as a kidnapping. In the instability of 1977, wealthy merchants were often extorted by factions within the government who sought to fund their own private interests. The gold scattered on the seat was a cynical touch, a way to make the event look like a robbery gone wrong while the real prize was taken away. He was likely held in a private facility, his fate decided by men who carried the law. The group responsible was a clandestine unit that operated with total impunity, utilizing the city's natural geography and political chaos to mask their movements. They didn't leave tracks because they were the ones who wrote the reports. They understood that in a city of millions, The easiest way to make a person disappear is to take them in the middle of a crowded bridge surrounded by fog and fear. They were the ones who ensured that the truth on the Rama 6 bridge stayed buried. Every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, Samchai's family returns to the Rama 6 bridge. They place a single gold leaf offering into the river, watching as it catches the light before disappearing into the dark water. They still have no body to bury, but they maintain the vigil as a way to keep his memory alive in a city that has long since moved on. To them, the merchant is still out there in the fog, waiting for the one day when the air finally clears and he can come home. A gold leaf floating on a river. It is a small, quiet gesture that carries the weight of a lifetime of questions and the silence of a city that never answers. But in the next case, the evidence would not be a scattered bag of gold or an idling car. It would be a single mud-caked boot found in the dark corner of a hidden cellar thousands of miles away, in a place where the winter wind never stops. That was the Arctic night of 1976, when a boy walked out of a dance. The sound of muffled dance music is always a little bit haunting when it is carried across a frozen landscape by a sub-zero wind. In November of 1976, the town of Piteå was already locked in the grip of a Swedish winter that felt like it would never end. The air was so dry and cold that it felt like breathing in tiny shards of glass. The sky was a deep, endless black, and the only light came from the orange glow of the street lamps, reflecting off the fresh snow that covered the quiet residential streets. To those sitting by a fire at 2 a.m, the northern winter is a physical presence that demands respect. It is a season of long nights and short gray days where the sun barely clears the horizon. In a small town like Piteå, the cold wasn't just weather, it was the boundary of your world. You lived between the heat of the stove and the heavy insulation of your coat. The silence of the Arctic night was absolute, broken only by the occasional groan of the sea ice or the sharp crack of a frozen branch in the woods. Charles Zelmanovitz was 15 years old, a gentle boy with a quiet laugh and a circle of friends who had known him since they were in diapers. In a town of only a few thousand people, your life was a shared story. Charles was the kind of kid who never missed a curfew and always made sure his younger siblings were looked after before he went out. He was a student at the local school, a place where the hallways were currently buzzing with the excitement of the upcoming winter dance, a rare bright spot in the dark month. He spent the afternoon of the dance making sure his clothes were just right, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement that only a teenager can truly understand. He met his friends outside the school gym, their voices loud and energetic against the quiet of the night. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of floor wax and perfume, a stark contrast to the brutal conditions waiting on the other side of the brick walls. Charles moved through the crowd with a shy confidence, enjoying the music and the shared energy of his classmates. The dance was a world of its own, a space of bright lights and pop songs, where the freezing darkness outside seemed like another planet. Charles wasn't the loudest boy in the room, but he was always present, a grounding force for his friends. He spent hours laughing and talking about the future, about what they would do when they finally left the small town. To Charles, the world was a wide, inviting place, and the path home was a simple line. He had walked 100 times without incident. He felt a deep sense of belonging. In a town like Piteå in the mid-70s, the sense of security was absolute. Parents didn't worry about their children walking a few blocks in the dark because there was nowhere for a person to hide. Every porch light was a beacon, and every neighbor was a set of eyes. Charles felt the familiar weight of his winter coat and the rough texture of his wool hat as he prepared to leave. He was a boy who understood the rules of the North. Stay on the path, move quickly, and never underestimate how fast the cold can sap your strength. As the final song ended, the crowd of teenagers spilled out into the night, their breath turning into thick, white clouds. The sub-zero air hit their faces like a physical weight, instantly numbing their cheeks and making their eyes water. Charles laughed with his friends, the sound of their boots crunching on the frozen snow, a rhythmic percussion in the silent street. They walked together for a few blocks, a tight-knit group moving toward the residential district where the lights of home were already waiting for them in the distance. Charles was carrying a small bag with his dance shoes, his fingers tucked deep into his pockets to ward off the creeping numbness. He felt the steady, deep cold of the pavement through the soles of his boots, a sensation that reminded him he was only a few minutes from his own front door. He was a kid who lived for these moments of independence, the short walks through the silent town that made him feel like he was finally growing up. He nodded to his friends as they reached the first intersection, his eyes bright in the moon. The plan was simple. Charles would take the short route through a small patch of woods that sat between the school and his house. It was a path he had taken hundreds of times during the summer, a familiar trail that cut 5 minutes off his journey. His friends watched him head toward the tree line, his silhouette clear against the white snow. He waved once, a quick and casual gesture, before the shadows of the pine trees swallowed him. It was a routine movement, a small choice that should have meant absolutely nothing. The woods were a familiar landscape of birch and pine, their branches heavy with snow. In the summer, the path was a golden tunnel of light, but in the winter, it was a world of gray and black. Charles moved quickly, his boots finding the packed dirt beneath the drifts. He was focused on the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of his parents' voices. He didn't look back, and he didn't notice the way the wind seemed to die down as he moved deeper into the thicket. He was a boy of the north, and the woods were his home. As he walked, the silence of the trees began to feel more pronounced. The sound of the music from the gym had faded, replaced by the soft, rhythmic hoot of an owl and the distant creak of a frozen branch. Charles felt a brief, strange sensation of pressure in his chest, a sudden awareness of how small he was in the vastness of the winter night. He adjusted his grip on the bag of shoes, the plastic rustling loudly in the quiet air. He quickened his pace, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps as the cold began to bite. His friends reached their own homes and settled into the warmth, assuming Charles had done the same. But as the clock in the Zelmanovitz house ticked past midnight, the silence from the front door became heavy. Charles's father sat by the window watching the empty street, his heart beginning to thud with a slow, rhythmic dread. By 2 a.m, the entire neighborhood was awake. The sub-zero wind was howling now, blowing fresh drifts of snow across the very tracks that Charles had left behind in the woods. The first strange detail was the lack of any sign of a struggle. When the search parties entered the small patch of woods the next morning, they expected to find a fallen boy or a discarded bag. Instead, they found a forest that looked as if it had never been touched. The snow was a pristine, unbroken sheet of white. There were no footprints leading in and certainly none leading out. It was as if Charles had stepped into the shadows of the trees and simply evaporated, leaving the town of Pidio to face a mystery. The search for Charles turned into a desperate battle against the Arctic winter. Hundreds of volunteers combed the forests and the coastlines, their movements sluggish in the deep snow and the biting wind. The pressure on the local police was immense, but every lead they followed ended in a dead end. Fear began to settle over the town like a layer of ice. Parents who had once let their children walk alone now kept them inside with the curtains drawn, their eyes fixed on the dark tree line that had swallowed a boy. Month after month, the silence continued. The snow melted in the spring, revealing the moss and the stones, but it did not reveal Charles. The case began to grow cold, moving from the front pages of the newspapers to the back of the filing cabinets in the station. The Zelmanovitz family lived in a state of suspended animation, their lives divided into before and after that November night. The small town of Pidio became a place of whispers and suspicion, where every neighbor was looked at with a new, agonizing level of scrutiny. The investigation into the disappearance was a masterclass in the limitations of the era. Without surveillance cameras or digital footprints, the police were forced to rely on the memories of teenagers and the instincts of local hunters. They checked the frozen lakes and the old mining shafts, but the land remained silent. There was a sense that Charles hadn't just gone missing. He had been erased by the very geography he trusted. The woods near the school became a place of dread, a section of the town that no one walked through. It is a regional reality of the subarctic that the terrain is far more complex than it appears on a map. Beneath the snow and the moss, the ground is a honeycomb of old rock cellars, forgotten storage pits, and natural crevices. These spaces are often hidden by decades of growth, turning the landscape into a series of traps for the unwary. In a town like Piteo, the history of the land is built in layers, and sometimes the most dangerous parts are the ones that have been forgotten by the people living on the surface. 17 years passed before the forest finally gave up its secret. In 1993, a surveyor was working in a remote area, just a few hundred yards from the school where the dance had been held. He was scouting a location for a new project when he stumbled upon a hidden rock cellar, its entrance obscured by decades of overgrown brush and fallen timber. He cleared away the debris, the smell of damp earth and stagnant air rushing out to meet him. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw a shape in the corner. The surveyor's flashlight caught a glint of something artificial amidst the mud and the stones of the cellar floor. It was a single worn boot, its leather cracked and caked with the filth of nearly 2 decades. He felt a sudden sharp coldness in his chest as he realized what he was looking at. He didn't move any further into the cellar. He backed away, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps, and called the authorities. The town of Piteå held its breath as the forensic teams arrived to descend into the hole. Inside the cellar, the police found the remains of Charles Zelmanovitz. He hadn't been buried. He had been placed in a corner, his belongings arranged in a way that suggested a bizarre, intentional pattern. His dance shoes were sitting neatly next to him, and his winter coat was spread out as if he were resting. The autopsy was unable to determine a cause of death due to the passage of time, but the location of the body was the most chilling detail. He had been right there in the middle of the search zone. The cellar was an old storage space that had been forgotten by the town, a relic of a previous century that even the local kids didn't use. To hide a body, there required a specific knowledge of the terrain and a level of comfort with the dark that most people don't possess. The investigation was reopened with a new frantic energy. The police looked for signs of a third party, for fibers or fingerprints that might have survived the damp, but the rock and the mud were indifferent to their questions. The silence remained. The discovery of the remains brought a grim closure to the family, but it also opened a new chapter of questions. The police were forced to admit that they had missed the cellar during the initial search, a failure that haunted the older officers. They began to look for suspects among the people who lived in the immediate vicinity of the school, searching for someone who would have known about the hidden cellar. The focus shifted from a missing person to a cold case murder, and the town's suspicion returned. Then came the twist that would derail the Swedish justice system for years. A man named Thomas Quick, already incarcerated for other crimes, confessed to the murder of Charles Zelmanovitz. He provided details that seemed to match the crime scene, and for a moment the town felt a sense of relief. But as the years went on, investigative journalists began to pull at the threads of his story. They discovered that Quick was a serial confessor who had been fed details by investigators and was desperate for attention. By the time Quick's confessions were officially overturned, the trail for the real killer was long gone. The realization that the investigation had been led down a years-long dead end was a second tragedy for the Zelmanovitz family. The town was left with the original question: how did a 15-year-old boy end up in a forgotten cellar just a few minutes from his school? The lack of evidence suggested a predator who was a local, someone who knew exactly where to hide a body so that even search dogs would fail. The reconstruction of that night suggests a killer who didn't use a car or a weapon. He likely used the cover of the snowstorm to intercept Charles in the woods, utilizing his knowledge of the shortcuts to stay one step ahead of the boy. He was a person who moved through the shadows of Piteå with total confidence, perhaps even joining the search parties the next morning to stay close to the investigation. He was a predator who didn't look like a monster, but like a neighbor who was helping to find a boy. This man understood the architecture of the town's secrets. He knew the location of the rock cellar, and he knew that once the snow began to fall in earnest, the search would be focused on the larger forests and the coastline. He used the cellar as a temporary blind spot, a place where he could hide the evidence of his crime while the rest of the world was looking elsewhere. He was a person driven by a high need for control, a stalker who viewed the small town of Piteå as his own private grounds. The truth is that the killer likely lived out the rest of his life in Piteå, watching the memorial services and listening to the whispers in the grocery store. He was a master of the ordinary, a person who could commit a brutal act and then return to his dinner table as if nothing had happened. He relied on the town's inherent trust and the limitations of forensic science to keep his secret. He was a part of the community, a shadow that never left hidden by the very normalcy of his existence. Today, the statute of limitations has passed and the case is officially closed. The town of Piteå has tried to move on, but the memory of Charles remains a permanent part of the landscape. A small memorial site has been established where the cellar once stood, a place of stones and wildflowers where residents still leave candles on winter nights. In 2026, it is a site of quiet reflection, a reminder of a boy who walked into the dark and found that the most dangerous places are the ones we think we know. The silence of the Swedish north is a heavy thing. a reminder of the secrets that the land chooses to keep. For the Zelmanovitz family, the answers will never be complete, but the boy who walked out of a dance in 1976 is no longer lost. He is a part of the town's history, a name that carries the weight of a generation's fear. The rock cellar has been filled in, but the shadows of the pine trees still hold a story that no one will ever fully be able to tell. People talk about how dangerous the world is, and how we should be afraid of the deep unknown woods. But most of the time, the danger doesn't come from a stranger in a far-off place. It comes from someone who knows your name, someone who has walked the same streets and breathed the same cold air. It is the proximity that makes it haunting. On the other side of the ocean, a woman was about to step out of a party and discover that even a crowd cannot protect you from the silence of the sea. It was 10 o'clock on a Friday night in November of 1975, when the heavy tropical humidity of Lagos seemed to settle over the Ikoyi district like a warm, damp blanket. Inside a sprawling mansion, the air was filled with the upbeat, brassy sounds of high-life jazz and the clinking of champagne glasses. Men in tailored suits and women in vibrant silk dresses moved through the garden, their voices rising above the rhythm of the drums. The scent of the Atlantic Ocean was never far away, carrying a sharp, salty tang that cut through the smell of expensive perfumes and roasted meat. Outside the high walls of the compound, the city of Lagos hummed with a different energy. But inside the world was a series of manicured lawns and soft lantern light. The heat was constant, making the air feel thick enough to touch, vibrating with the energy of a nation that was finally coming into its own. Aduke Ojo stood near the edge of the dance floor, her presence alone enough to pull the attention of every room she entered. At 25 years old, she was a fashion icon, a woman whose face was known in every social circle, from the markets to the ministries. She had a way of wearing traditional lace and silk that made the old world feel modern. To the people watching her, Aduke was more than just a merchant's daughter. She was the face of a new glamorous Nigeria. Her father's wealth was legendary, built on decades of shipping and trade that stretched across the globe. Aduke had grown up with the finest of everything, but she was never content to simply be a socialite. She was a woman with a sharp mind for business, already managing her own textile exports and planning a trip to London to secure a new partnership. Her life was a fast-paced rhythm of appointments, parties, and family duties, and she navigated it all with a practiced, easy smile. As the night wore on, the heat inside the mansion became suffocating. Aduke felt a sudden, sharp prickle of sweat along her hairline and a sense of tightness in her chest. She needed a moment of quiet, a chance to breathe without the pressure of a dozen conversations. She excused herself from a group of government officials, her silk shawl draped elegantly over her arm, and walked toward the back of the garden. She moved into the shadows, the music fading into a dull, distant throb. A long, black luxury limousine was parked near the side gate, its engine idling with a low, rhythmic vibration. The driver, a man who had served her family for 10 years, stepped out and opened the back door with a silent nod. Aduke climbed into the cool, dark leather interior, the air conditioning hitting her skin with a sudden, numbing chill. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, telling him to just drive for a while toward the shore where the air was moving. The following morning, just as the sun began to bake the sand of Bar Beach, a group of early morning walkers found the black limousine. It was bogged deep in the white sand nearly 50 yards from the road, with the driver's door and the rear door standing wide open. There were no tracks leading away from the car, and the engine had long since died. The silence of the beach was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy crashing of the Atlantic waves against the shore. One of the walkers approached the vehicle and saw a luxury silk shawl snagged in the latch of the back door. It was a vibrant, intricate pattern of gold and blue, flapping violently in the sea breeze like a distress signal. Inside the car, Aduke's leather handbag sat on the floor, her wallet and jewelry untouched. There was no blood on the upholstery and no sign of a struggle, but the interior smelled strongly of the salt air and a strange chemical odor that didn't belong. The driver was found an hour later, lying unconscious in a patch of coastal scrub nearly a mile from the car. When he finally woke up in a local clinic, he was in a state of total confusion. He claimed he remembered nothing after leaving the Ikoyi mansion. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were shaking, a physical reaction to a trauma he couldn't put into words. This is a social reality of the elite. In 1970s, Lagos, Sometimes the most loyal people are the first to be silenced. The investigation into Aduke's disappearance was met with a wall of silence from the party guests. In a city of high-level politics and shifting alliances, no one wanted to admit they had seen the girl leave or who might have been following the car. The Ojo family offered a massive reward enough to buy a fleet of cars, but the leads remained thin. The police combed the coastal forests and the shipping docks, but Aduke Ojo had seemingly evaporated into the humid night air. A local fisherman later reported seeing a small, high-powered motorboat waiting just offshore near Bar Beach around midnight. He described the boat as having no lights, appearing as a dark, silent silhouette against the moonlit water. He watched as a smaller craft made a quick trip to the sand and back before the main boat vanished into the deep sea. This clue suggested a level of maritime coordination that went far beyond a common kidnapping. It was an extraction. You are sitting in the back of a luxury car, the smell of your own perfume mixing with a sudden sharp scent of ether. The driver doesn't look back as the car swerves toward the sand. You try to reach for the door, but your muscles feel like lead, and the sound of the ocean is getting louder, a rhythmic pounding that mimics the panic in your heart. You want to scream, but your voice is gone, lost in the roar of the surf. This is a moment where the world simply stops. The reconstruction of the disappearance showed a highly organized criminal group with deep knowledge of Aduke's habits. They likely used a fast-acting sedative to neutralize the driver and Aduke before moving her to the boat. By leaving the jewelry and money behind, they sent a message that this was not about wealth, but about the girl herself. She was taken by sea, bypassing every roadblock and police patrol in the city, disappearing into the vast anonymity of the Atlantic. The group responsible was likely a specialized unit capable of enforcing a total silence among the Lagos elite. They didn't leave tracks because they utilized the water, a boundary that doesn't hold footprints. They understood that the loudest way to make a statement in a city of noise is to create a void that can never be filled. Aduke was a prize taken to settle a debt or to secure a partnership that her father had refused, a victim of a world where beauty is often just another asset. In 2024, a set of personal items suspected to belong to Aduke were found in a small border town near Benin, but DNA testing on the remains found nearby remained inconclusive. The Ojo family still maintains a search fund in 2026, 50 years after she walked out of that Ikoyi garden. The case remains a bleak reminder of the era when the wealthy were just as vulnerable as anyone else once they stepped into the shadows. The beach has long since washed away the car tracks. Sometimes the lights of a party are just a way to hide the darkness waiting at the edge of the lawn. It is a feeling that stays with you, the idea that the world you know can be overwritten in the time it takes to draw a single breath. Sometimes the things we fear are not in the woods or the alleys, but in the light itself. It is a moment right before everything changes, when the air is still and the world still looks fine, that the silence truly begins to take hold. The air in the Amazon doesn't just hang, it presses against you. In 1977 on the island of Colares, that pressure started to feel different. There was a low electromagnetic hum that seemed to vibrate in the roots of your teeth. It made the hair on the back of your neck stand up long before you ever saw anything. It was a sound that didn't belong to the forest or the river. It was the sound of a predator that didn't follow the laws of biology. The island of Colares was a world built on the rhythm of the water. For the people who lived there, the Amazon River was not just a geographic feature. It was their provider, their road, and their clock. Life was slow, dictated by the movement of the tides and the seasonal rise and fall of the floodwaters. The village was a collection of stilted wooden houses with palm-thatched roofs nestled between the thick green wall of the jungle and the vast brown expanse of the river. The men of the island were mostly fishermen individuals who knew every sandbar and every hidden inlet for miles in every direction. They spent their days on the water in small wooden boats, their skin darkened to a deep bronze by the equatorial sun. Their hands were thick and calloused from pulling nets and gutting the day's catch. It was a simple, hard-working existence, where the biggest concerns were the price of salt and the reliability of the local trade boats. Almir was a man who embodied this way of life. He was a fisherman in his late 30s, a person of few words but deep instincts. He had spent his entire life on the island, learning the secrets of the river from his father and grandfather. He was a husband and a father of 3. a man whose world was entirely contained within the boundaries of Colares and the surrounding forest. To Almir, the island was a sanctuary, a place where he felt grounded and secure in his role as a provider. Every morning before the sun cleared the horizon, Almir would walk down to the riverbank, the wet mud squeezing between his toes. He loved the stillness of the dawn, the way the mist rose off the water in thin, ghostly ribbons. He would check his gear with a practiced hand, ensuring his nets were mended and his motor was ready. There was a profound sense of peace in this routine, a feeling that as long as he followed the rules of the river, his life and his family would remain stable. His house was a place of constant, quiet activity. His wife Benedita managed the household with a mechanical efficiency, moving between the garden and the cooking fire. The air inside the house always smelled of wood smoke and dried fish, a grounding aroma that signaled home. Their children played in the dirt beneath the house, their laughter a constant backdrop to the day's labor. It was a life of modest means, but it was a life that felt complete and fundamentally honest. Almir took pride in the safety he provided. He had built their house with his own hands, selecting the sturdiest timber from the forest and lashing it together with vine and wire. He believed that the walls of his home were a barrier against the wildness of the jungle and the unpredictability of the weather. To him, danger was something you could see and hear, a jaguar in the undergrowth or a sudden storm on the river. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he didn't fear the sky. The social life of the island centered on the village square, a flat patch of dirt where people gathered in the evenings to trade stories and smoke. The atmosphere was one of deep, unshakable trust. These were families who had lived alongside one another for generations, sharing their resources and their burdens. They lived far from the bustling cities of Brazil, in a place where modern technology was a rare and often confusing luxury. Their reality was the earth and the seasons. The elders of Colares often spoke of the legends of the forest of spirits that moved through the trees and creatures that lived beneath the water. Almir listened to these stories with a polite but detached interest. He was a man of the physical world, someone who believed in the things he could touch and see. He found comfort in the predictable nature of the environment, the way the stars moved across the sky, and the way the birds signaled the coming of the rain. The world made sense. During the harvest months, the village felt like a single cohesive unit. Everyone worked toward the common goal of securing enough food for the coming months. There was a sense of shared purpose that made the hard work feel lighter. Almir would return from the river at dusk, his boat low in the water with the weight of his catch, and feel a surge of satisfaction. He was part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, a chain of men who had pulled a living from the same brown water. He often spent his nights on the river, utilizing the cool air to work longer hours. He found a rare kind of solitude in the middle of the stream, with only the sound of the water lapping against the hull and the distant calls of the monkeys in the trees. The stars over the Amazon were bright and countless, a vast canopy that made him feel small but connected to the universe. He never felt alone in the dark. The river was his companion, a familiar friend that he trusted with his life. The first offbeat detail occurred on a Tuesday evening in late September. A group of women were walking home from the communal laundry area when they saw a narrow blue beam of light descend from the clouds. It didn't flash like lightning. It was a steady, solid pillar of light that seemed to search the ground with a terrifying, intelligent purpose. One of the women described the beam as chasing her through the village, cornering her against a wall before suddenly vanishing. Within a few weeks, the blue beams were no longer a novelty. They were a constant threat. The villagers began to report strange metallic objects that would hover silently over their homes at night. They called the phenomenon the chupa-chupa, which roughly translates to the blood-sucker. People claimed that the beams felt like hot needles piercing their skin, and they described a sensation of being paralyzed and drained of all their physical energy while the light was on them. The pressure on the island began to tighten into a state of mass panic. People stopped going out at night, and many began to carry torches and lanterns at all times, believing that fire might ward off the lights. The local doctor, a woman named Weimar, began to see a surge of patients suffering from unexplained symptoms. They had identical pin-sized punctures on their chests and necks, surrounded by circular radiation burns. Most disturbingly, every victim was suffering from acute anemia. Dr. Weimar was a woman of science, but she was finding it impossible to explain what she was seeing. The punctures were deep, leading straight to the heart or major arteries, yet there was no sign of a struggle and no exit wounds. She noted that the patients looked like they had been drained of nearly half their blood supply in a matter of seconds. The burns were consistent with high-level radiation, but the clothes of the victims were never damaged. It was a clinical predatory harvest. The island was paralyzed by a fear that was both intense and invisible. The people of Colares felt like they were being hunted by a force they couldn't understand and couldn't fight. They stayed awake all night, huddled together in their homes, listening for the low hum that preceded the appearance of the lights. The once peaceful village was now a place of shadows and hushed whispers. The trust they had in the land was gone, replaced by a constant, agonizing scrutiny of the sky. Almir refused to give in to the fear at first. He continued his night fishing, believing that the river was still his sanctuary. But one morning, his boat was found drifting near the shore, empty. A search party fanned out across the beach, their hearts heavy with the silence of the morning. They found Almir lying on the sand near a cluster of palm trees. He was on his back, his eyes open and staring at the blue sky, but the man who had known the river so well was completely gone. When they turned his body over the village, elders let out a collective gasp. On Almir's chest, right over his heart, were two small, perfectly circular punctures. The skin around them was charred, purple and black, a vivid mark of extreme heat that stood out against his pale, bloodless skin. Most chillingly, his cotton work shirt was untouched. There was no hole in the fabric and no blood on the shirt. It was as if the light had passed through the clothing to strike the man beneath it. The discovery of Almir's body was the point of no return for the island. The Brazilian Air Force was called in to investigate the situation, launching a secret mission known as Operation Saucer. A team of officers led by a man named Captain Hollanda arrived with sophisticated cameras and radar equipment. They set up a base on the coast, expecting to find evidence of secret weapons testing or a bizarre natural phenomenon. They were prepared for a military investigation, not a ghost story. Captain Hollanda was a man of discipline and logic. He spent his nights on the beaches and in the forests, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was skeptical of the villagers' stories until he saw the lights for himself. He captured over 500 photographs and hours of film showing unidentified objects that moved with a speed and maneuverability that defied the laws of physics. The objects were metallic, glowing with a pulsing blue light, and they seemed to be aware of the military's presence. The investigation moved through the island with a frantic, desperate energy. The officers interviewed dozens of victims, each story matching the last with a terrifying consistency. They found that the objects were most active near the water and seemed to target individuals who were alone. Hollanda began to suspect that the lights were not just observing the islanders, but were actively collecting biological samples. He felt a sense of mounting dread, a feeling that he was witnessing a harvest. Despite the mountain of evidence and the physical trauma of the villagers, the military abruptly shut down Operation Saucer in early 1978. Captain Hollanda was ordered to pack up his equipment and return to the mainland immediately. All of the photographs, the film, and the medical records were seized and classified as top secret. The official explanation was that the mission had found no evidence of a threat to national security. The island was left to face the shadows alone. The twist in the case came decades later, when Captain Hollanda, then a retired officer, finally decided to speak the truth. He claimed that the military had hidden the evidence because they were terrified of what they had found. He described objects that could enter and exit the water without making a splash, and beams of light that could lift heavy objects or paralyze a man in an instant. He believed that the government was hiding the fact that the island had been a testing ground for non-human tech. Shortly after giving his final explosive interview, Captain Hollanda was found dead in his home. The official cause was suicide, but many who knew him believed he had been silenced for breaking his decades of secrecy. His death added another layer of mystery to the Colares case, suggesting that the truth was still being guarded by those in power. The files remained locked away, and the people of the island were left with only their memories and the marks on their skin to prove what happened. Dr. Wellide also maintained her testimony until the end of her career. She insisted that the medical anomalies she saw on the island were not the result of any known earthly disease or weapon. She had examined patients whose blood cells had been destroyed at a molecular level, a process that required a level of energy control that didn't exist in 1977. She believed the Chupa Chupa was a clinical predator, a thing that viewed the human heart as nothing more than a container. The reconstruction of the events showed a killer that operated with a chilling mathematical precision. The entity didn't use blades or bullets, it used light as a surgical tool. It would lock onto a victim and deploy a targeted burst of heat energy that bypassed clothing to reach the blood-rich tissue of the heart. The extraction was likely instantaneous, leaving the victim alive but drained of the very fuel their body needed to survive. It was a method that was as efficient as it was heartless. The identity of the predator remains the greatest mystery of the Amazon. Whether it was a secret government project, a natural atmospheric phenomenon, or something truly from beyond our world, the result was the same. The people of Colares were treated as resources to be harvested their lives, interrupted by a force that didn't even acknowledge their humanity. The killer had no face and no motive that we can understand, leaving behind only the silence of the beach and the holes in the sand. In 2025, the Brazilian government declassified a final batch of photos from the original Operation Saucer files. These images, now available to forensic experts, confirm the physical trauma on the bodies of Almir and the other victims. The punctures are perfectly circular, made with a level of precision that modern lasers still struggle to match. 50 years later, the island of Colares is peaceful again, but the elders still look at the sky with a deep, silent caution whenever the hum returns. The memory of 1977 is a permanent part of the island's landscape. The stilted houses have been rebuilt, and the children still play in the river, but the stories of the Chupa Chupa are passed down with the same reverence as the ancient legends of the jungle. The people of Colares know that the world is much larger and more dangerous than it appears on a map. They understand that sometimes the things that come out of the dark are not looking for your gold or your land. The room is quiet now. The stories have finished their work on the air, but they are still working on your mind. It is that specific kind of silence that follows a long night of truth, where the shadows in the corner of your eye seem a little deeper than they were an hour ago. You start to realize that it is not the endings that haunt you, but the spaces between the events, the moments where life was still normal. We look back at the 1970s and see a world that felt more grounded, yet infinitely more fragile. There were no digital footprints to follow, no global positioning systems to trace a final path, and no instant messages to say goodbye. When someone walked into the night back then, they did not just leave a room, they left the map entirely. That realization carries a heavy weight. It reminds us how easily a life can be unplugged. What lingers after these accounts is not the image of the act itself, but the objects left behind. A child's red hair clip resting in the gravel, a pair of white silk gloves placed neatly on a chest, a steaming cup of coffee sitting next to a body in a room that was bolted from the inside. These are not just pieces of evidence. They are anchors for a kind of dread that does not go away with the morning light or the sound of the birds. These mundane items become terrifying because they represent the intersection of the ordinary and the impossible. We all have a favorite shawl, a specific way we take our coffee, or a shortcut we take through the woods. When those personal details are twisted into a crime scene, the safety of our own lives begins to feel like an illusion. The horror comes from the thought that the things we love can be used to mark the end of us. We are left with questions that do not have easy answers. How does a man in a tailored suit walk away from a tragedy with the poise of an aristocrat? How does a boy evaporate from a path he has walked 1,000 times before? These gaps in the narrative are where the real fear lives. We try to fill them with logic, but the logic of the 1970s is often a dead end. We are forced to sit with the mystery, letting it breathe. There is a psychological residue that sticks to the survivors and the towns they live in. In places like Pidio or Macerata, the disappearance of a single person or a family changes the geography of the community forever. A woods is no longer just a collection of trees. It is a monument to a missing boy. A farmhouse is no longer a home. It is a locked box of secrets. The collective memory of a town becomes a map of the places they no longer go. The families of the missing live in a state of suspended animation that the rest of us can barely imagine. To them, the 1970s never truly ended. They are still waiting for a door to open or a phone to ring with a voice they have not heard in 50 years. Their grief has no statute of limitations. It is a steady, rhythmic throb that stays in the background of every holiday and every quiet Tuesday night. It is a tragedy without a period. We talk about the Victoria Demon or the Gentleman Killer as if they were monsters from a movie, but the reality is much more chilling. They were men who stood in bread lines and watched the same news as everyone else. They were people who understood the architecture of trust and knew exactly how to use it as a weapon. The most dangerous predators do not hide in the shadows. They hide in the light wearing a tailored suit and a polite smile. The psychological aftershock of an unsolved case is a specific kind of poison. It breeds a suspicion that never quite dissolves. When a killer is never caught, every neighbor becomes a potential suspect and every friendly face carries a shadow of doubt. The community begins to look inward, looking for the cracks in the facade of normalcy. You start to wonder if the person who helped you search for your child was the one who took them away. It is the detail of the locked room that fascinates and repels us. We spend our lives building fortresses, bolting the doors, drawing the curtains, and setting the alarms. We want to believe that if we are careful enough, the world cannot reach us. But these stories suggest that the walls we build are often just scenery. A predator who knows the ventilation or the crawl spaces does not care about your locks. Safety is a story we tell ourselves. We find ourselves thinking about the victims not as names on a police file, but as people who had plans for the next morning. They were thinking about a textile deal in London or a quiet retirement on a farm. They were caught in the middle of a thought, a conversation, or a cup of coffee. The abruptness of their exits is what creates the resonance. It reminds us that the line between here and gone is much thinner than we are comfortable admitting. The fear that comes from these stories is not a jump scare. It is a slow burn. It is the realization that the world is much larger and more indifferent than we like to think. The fog on the Rama 6 bridge or the mist on the Bosphorus does not care about your status or your wealth. The environment itself can become a co-conspirator, hiding the tracks of a predator and muffling the cries of the lost. Nature is a silent witness that never takes a side. We listen to these stories because we are looking for a way to survive. We think that if we can understand the method of the killer or the mistake of the victim, we can avoid the same fate. But the lesson of the 1970s is that sometimes there is no mistake. Sometimes you are just the person in the path of a storm. The fear is a tool for awareness, a way to sharpen our instincts and remind us to look twice at the shadow in the hall. There is a strange comfort in the shared experience of this late-night audio. You are listening in your own space, perhaps with the rain on the window, but you are not alone in the feeling. Thousands of others are sitting with the same questions and the same lingering dread. We are a crew of night watchers looking for the truth in the dark. This connection helps to dissipate the isolation that these stories try to create within our minds. The stories of the light bodies in Brazil or the ghost train in Romania suggest that there are forces in this world, military, political, or otherwise, that operate beyond our reach. They exist in the gaps of the law and the shadows of the regime. The psychological impact of realizing that you are a pawn in a game you do not know the rules to is profound. It creates a sense of helplessness that is far more terrifying than a common crime. We are left with the image of the dried rose in the safe. It is a cinematic detail, but the reality of it is a heart of ice. It represents a killer who was so confident and so personal that they left a piece of their own history behind as a taunt. It is a reminder that some vendettas do not have an expiration date. They wait in the dark for years, growing cold and sharp until the moment is exactly right to settle the score in the rain. The 1970s were an analog era of mystery that we can never truly replicate today. In our world of constant surveillance and instant data, the idea of someone evaporating feels like a legend. But the feelings of the era, the isolation, the trust, and the sudden silent tragedy are universal. They are part of the human condition. We are still the same people sitting by the same fires wondering what is moving in the woods outside. The aftershock of these stories is a reminder to appreciate the ordinary. The simple act of finishing a meal with your family or walking home under a street lamp is a luxury that was taken from the people in these accounts. We should not live in a state of constant terror, but we should live with a sense of gratitude for the safety we do have. Every locked door and every morning light is a victory over the silence that was waiting for them. The narrator pull back now, leaving the stories to settle into the back of your mind. You will remember the salt circles and the white gloves when you are tidying your own house. You will think of the bridge in Bangkok when you are driving through the fog. These stories become a part of your own internal library, a set of warnings and whispers that help you navigate the world with a little more care and a lot more awareness. As you prepare to close your eyes, take a deep breath of the air in your room. It is quiet and it is safe. The shadows are just shadows, and the sounds outside are just the world moving on. You have survived the night's journey into the dark, and you are still here. The truth of these stories is a heavy thing to carry, but it is also a way to ground yourself in the reality of the present. You are awake, you are aware, and you are home. If these stories have stayed with you, if they have made you look at the world a little differently tonight, then they have done their job. We tell them not to celebrate the darkness, but to understand it. I hope you found a sense of connection in the telling. Please subscribe and join us again for more journeys into the places where the light does not reach. I would love to hear your thoughts on which of these cases haunts you the most. Stay safe in the coming days. Look after the people you care about and never take the rhythm of your routine for granted. The world is a beautiful place, but it is also a place of deep water and long shadows. It is better to be the person who checks the locks than the person who assumes the door is already bolted. Sleep well, night crew. The morning will be here soon enough, and the shadows will retreat once again into the trees. The rain is still falling and the fire is almost out. It is time for us to part ways for now. Take the silence with you, but do not let it weigh you down. Use it as a space for reflection and a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. We are the ones who tell the stories, and as long as we keep telling them, the names of the lost will never be forgotten. They are a part of us now. Until next time, stay safe. Thank you for being part of the night crew. Your presence here makes the darkness a little less cold. If you found value in these accounts, please share them with a friend who appreciates the truth as much as you do. It is through these shared moments that we build a community of awareness. Don't forget to check the links in the description for more information on these cases and how you can support the search for the missing. Good night, everyone. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be peaceful. The world is waiting for you in the morning bright and new, but for now, just listen to the rain and the silence. Everything is exactly as it should be. The locks are secure, the curtains are drawn, and you are safe. Close your eyes and let the weight of the day fall away. I will be here the next time the sun goes down. Good night.